There is an island in the Aegean Sea that still carries a boy's name, though no one is entirely sure where his body ever came to rest. Fishermen who worked those waters for generations used to say that on certain still mornings, when the light hit the water just right, you could almost believe you saw something pale drifting far below the surface. That is probably nothing more than old sailors' talk, the kind of story that gets passed from father to son, along with knots and nets and warnings about the wind. But the name stayed, the Icarian Sea, named, so the old story goes, for a boy who flew. Tonight we are not going to rush through that fall the way most retellings do, treating it as a single dramatic moment and nothing more. We are going to slow all the way down. We are going to walk through the workshop where the wings were built, feel the wax cooling under a craftsman's fingers, hear the creak of a tower door that locked a father and son away from the world, and sit with them through the long, quiet nights before anyone ever left the ground. This is the story of Icarus, and of his father Daedalus, and of a flight that has meant something different to almost everyone who has ever heard it. So get comfortable. We have a long, slow night ahead of us. Hey buddy, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the place where we take the old stories, the strange and beautiful ones that have survived thousands of years of retelling, and we slow them down until they feel less like legend and more like a memory. If this is your first night with us, I am glad you found your way here, and if you have been with us before, through Theseus and the bull-headed thing in the dark, through Perseus and his long walk toward a monster he was terrified to look at, then you already know how this works. We are not here to excite you. We are here to help you rest. So before we go any further, go ahead and get yourself settled. Dim the lights if you have not already. Pull the blanket up. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, because I promise you are holding tension up there that you do not need to be holding. If you find that these long, slow histories help you drift off at night, consider subscribing to the channel. It costs nothing. It takes about 2 seconds, and it means a new one of these will be waiting for you the next time your mind will not stop turning over the events of the day. I make these because I love them, and because there is something almost sacred about being trusted with someone's last waking hour. So thank you for that trust. Let's use it well tonight. Now, before we begin, I want to know where you are listening from and what time it is where you are right now. I am recording this on a quiet evening myself, somewhere well past the hour when most sensible people have already gone still, and there is something strange and lovely about knowing that these words might reach you in the middle of an afternoon in one country and the deep hours of night in another. Drop a comment and tell me your city and your time. I read every one, even the ones that come in long after I have posted this, and it means something to picture all of you scattered across so many different clocks, all settling down for the same story at different moments. Tonight's story comes to us from ancient Greece, though it is older than most of what survives from that world in any complete form. It comes to us in pieces, really, gathered from poets who lived centuries apart, each one adding a little more color, a little more feeling, until the shape we know today finally settled into place. The oldest fragments barely mention Icarus at all. It took the Roman poet Ovid, writing hundreds of years after the Greeks had first told versions of this tale, to give us the full, aching account of a father building wings for his son, and a boy who forgot, just for a few minutes, that some warnings exist for a reason. This is a story about craftsmanship, and about the island of Crete, and about a labyrinth built to hide something the king wished had never existed. It is about a tower with no door that opened from the outside, and about two people trying to build their way out of a prison using nothing but feathers, string, and wax. And underneath all of that, it is a story about what happens when a parent tries to protect a child from a danger that the child cannot yet fully imagine. That part of it, more than the wings, more than the fall, is the part that has kept this story alive for nearly 3,000 years. Parents have been telling children not to fly too close to the sun for so long that most of us have forgotten it was ever a literal warning before it became a saying. So let's go inside. Let's start not with wings, but with the world that made them necessary in the first place. Let's go to Crete. The island of the bull. I want you to imagine the island of Crete somewhere in the middle of the second millennium, before the modern calendar even began counting. This was not a small or a quiet place. Crete sat at the center of the ancient Mediterranean world the way a hub sits at the center of a wheel, and the people who lived there, the ones later Greeks would call the Minoans, had built something that most of their neighbors on the mainland could only imagine. Their great palace at Knossos was not a fortress bristling with walls the way you might picture an ancient stronghold. It had almost no defensive walls at all. Instead, it sprawled. Room after room after room, connected by corridors that turned and doubled back on themselves, staircases that climbed up through several stories of stone and timber, open courtyards that let the Mediterranean sun pour down onto painted floors. Archaeologists who excavated the site in the early 20th century, particularly a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans, found the remains of a building so complicated, so full of winding passages and unexpected turns, that some historians have wondered aloud whether the palace itself might have been the seed of the Labyrinth story, long before any bull-headed monster was added to the tale. Imagine wandering those halls for the first time as a visitor, a merchant perhaps, arriving from Egypt or from the Greek mainland with a cargo of goods to trade. You would have stepped off your ship into a harbor busy with movement, ropes creaking, men shouting instructions to each other in accents you might not fully recognize, the smell of tar and salt water and drying fish thick in the air. And then you would have walked inland toward a building so vast and so strange in its layout that getting lost inside it would have been the most natural thing in the world. The walls of that palace were covered in frescoes, paintings done directly onto wet plaster, so the color would sink into the stone itself and last for centuries. Blue dolphins leapt across painted walls in rooms meant for private audiences. Young men and women, painted with the pale skin of indoor life and dark hair curling down their backs, vaulted over the backs of charging bulls in scenes that still puzzle historians today. Was this an actual sport, a genuine athletic tradition where Cretan youths grabbed the horns of a bull and flipped themselves over its back? Or was it symbolic, a ritual captured in paint rather than in daily life? We are honestly not certain. But we do know that the bull mattered enormously to Cretan religion and Cretan identity, showing up again and again in their art, their pottery, their ceremonial objects. This was a culture built in some very real sense around the image of a bull. And this matters for our story because at the heart of it, in the myths the Greeks would later tell about this island, sat a king named Minos, and a curse involving a bull that would change the course of two lives forever. Now, whether Minos himself was a real historical king, or a title used by a whole line of Cretan rulers, or simply a legendary figure invented to explain a civilization, the later Greeks did not fully understand. Historians still debate. What we do know is that the mainland Greeks who eventually encountered the ruins of Minoan civilization, centuries after it had collapsed, inherited stories about a powerful sea king on Crete who commanded tribute from cities across the Aegean. And in the myth, this king had commissioned the finest craftsmen of his age to build him something extraordinary, a structure meant not to house a family or a court, but to hide something, a creature that was half man and half bull, born from a union so strange that even telling the story properly takes patience. I want you to imagine for a moment the man who was asked to build that hiding place. His name was Daedalus, and by every account that survives, he was the greatest inventor and craftsman the ancient world had ever produced. Later Greek writers credited him with inventing the saw, the axe, the level, and glue strong enough to hold wood joints together for a lifetime. Some accounts say he carved wooden statues so lifelike that people believed they could actually move, that their eyes seemed to follow you across a room, that their limbs seemed poised to step down from their pedestals at any moment. Whether any of that is literal truth or simply the kind of exaggeration that grows around a skilled craftsman's reputation over centuries of retelling, it tells us something important. Daedalus was not just clever. He was the kind of clever that made people a little uneasy, the kind of clever that seemed to brush right up against something forbidden. He had not always lived on Crete. The stories tell us he came originally from Athens, and that he left his home city under circumstances that were, frankly, not flattering to him. According to the most common version, Daedalus had taken on a nephew as an apprentice, a boy named Talos, or sometimes Perdix, depending on which ancient source you read. And this young apprentice turned out to be brilliant, perhaps even more brilliant than his uncle. The stories say the boy invented the saw after studying the spine of a fish, and the compass, the tool used for drawing perfect circles, after watching two sticks pivot against each other in the sand. Daedalus, so the story goes, grew jealous of a student who seemed poised to surpass him, and in a moment of rage and wounded pride, pushed the boy from a high place, perhaps the Acropolis itself, and killed him. It is a dark thread to find woven into the beginning of a story we usually remember for its craftsmanship and its wings, but it matters because it tells us something about the kind of man Daedalus was before he ever built anything on Crete. He was tried for the murder, found guilty, and exiled from Athens, forced to leave behind his home city and start over somewhere else entirely. And it was this exile that eventually brought him across the sea to the court of King Minos on Crete, where his reputation as an inventor had already traveled ahead of him. Now, I want you to imagine what that arrival must have felt like. A man in his middle years, skilled beyond almost anyone alive, but carrying the weight of exile and a crime he could never undo, stepping off a ship onto a foreign shore, uncertain of his welcome. Minos, it turned out, welcomed him warmly, because a king with grand ambitions for his palace and his kingdom had every reason to want the services of the finest craftsmen in the known world, regardless of what had happened back in Athens. Daedalus was given work, given status, given a workshop, and eventually given a task that would change everything. But before we get to that task, I think it is worth sitting for a moment with what daily life might have actually looked like for a craftsman living and working inside a great Bronze Age palace like Knossos. This is the kind of detail most retellings skip entirely, rushing straight to the labyrinth and the monster. But I think the texture of an ordinary day matters just as much as the extraordinary moments, maybe more, because it is the ordinary days that make up almost the whole of any life, even a mythic one. A craftsman's workshop in a palace like this would have been located, most likely, somewhere near the western wing, close enough to the storerooms where raw materials, wood, bronze, ivory, precious stones brought by trading ships from Egypt and the Levant, were kept under careful watch. Clay tablets written in the script we now call Linear B, which archaeologists eventually learned to read in the middle of the 20th century, reveal an administration obsessed with inventory. Scribes recorded everything. How much wool had been sheared? How many jars of olive oil sat in storage? How many bronze tripods had been commissioned and by whom? It was a world run on careful accounting, even as its art and architecture reached toward something almost dreamlike. Daedalus would have risen, most likely, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills, in a chamber probably somewhere within the palace complex itself, since a craftsman of his standing would have been housed close to his work rather than out among the ordinary town. Picture the sound of the palace waking around him. Somewhere below, servants would already be moving through the corridors, sandals slapping softly against painted plaster floors, carrying water in clay jars from the palace's remarkable network of channels and drains, a system so sophisticated that some historians consider it an early form of indoor plumbing, centuries ahead of almost anywhere else in the ancient world. The air in the morning would have carried the smell of baking bread from ovens somewhere in the palace kitchens, mixed with the sharper scent of olive oil being poured for the first meal. And beneath all of it, always, the faint mineral smell of the sea, since Knossos sat only a few miles inland from the northern coast, close enough that on certain mornings, with the wind blowing the right direction, you might catch a hint of salt water carried all the way up from the harbor at what is now called Heraklion. Daedalus would have eaten simply. Bread, most likely made from barley rather than the finer wheat reserved for feasts and offerings, along with olives, cheese made from goat or sheep's milk, and perhaps some dried fish left over from the previous evening. Wine, watered down considerably, since drinking it undiluted was considered a mark of poor manners or worse, would have accompanied the meal even this early in the day. And then, once the meal was finished, he would have made his way to his workshop, where the real labor of the day began. Picture that workshop for a moment. Wood shavings curling across a stone floor, the particular smell of sawdust, sharp and clean, mixing with the warmer, slightly sweet smell of heated pine resin, which craftsmen of this era used as a kind of adhesive and sealant for all sorts of purposes. Bronze tools, hammers and chisels and awls, hanging along one wall or resting in wooden racks built specifically to hold them. sunlight falling through a high window or an open doorway, catching the dust that always seems to hang suspended in a workshop where someone has been sanding wood or grinding stone. Daedalus's hands, by this point in his life, would have carried the marks of decades of this work. Calluses built up along his palms and fingers thick enough that he probably could not feel the rough grain of certain woods the way a newcomer would. Small white scars where a chisel had slipped, where a hot tool had brushed against skin, where a length of bronze wire had bitten into a fingertip during some earlier project. These are not the kinds of details that make it into most retellings of the myth, but I think they matter because they remind us that behind every legendary craftsman, there was simply a person who had spent an enormous number of ordinary days doing careful, repetitive, occasionally painful work with his hands. It was into this life, this rhythm of workshop mornings and palace routines, that the request came from King Minos, and it was not, at first, a request for wings. It was a request for something far stranger and far darker. It was a request to build a hiding place for a secret the king desperately needed to keep contained. Let's go inside that story now slowly, the way it deserves to be told. A secret that needed walls to understand why King Minos needed a labyrinth at all. We have to go back a little further, to a bargain the king had made with the sea god Poseidon, and to the strange, uncomfortable consequences of breaking that bargain. This part of the story tends to make people shift a little in their seats, because it involves things ancient audiences discussed far more openly than we tend to today. But I promise to tell it the way the old poets told it, plainly and without embarrassment, because that is how it survives, and there is no honest way to tell this story while skipping past its foundation. The story goes that Minos, in the early years of his reign, had prayed to Poseidon for a sign that his rule over Crete was rightful and divinely favored. He asked the god to send a bull up from the sea, promising that once it appeared, he would sacrifice it back to Poseidon in gratitude. Poseidon obliged, and from the waves rose a bull so magnificent, so pure white and powerfully built, that Minos could not bring himself to follow through on his promise. He kept the beautiful creature for himself, adding it to his herds, and sacrificed a lesser bull in its place, hoping the god would either not notice or not mind the substitution. Poseidon noticed. Gods in these stories almost always notice, and they are rarely forgiving about it. As punishment, the sea god caused Minos's wife, a queen named Pasiphae, to fall into an overwhelming and unnatural passion for the white bull itself. This is the part of the story that ancient audiences would have understood immediately as a mark of divine punishment, rather than any failing of the queen's own character. In these old myths, the gods frequently punished a wrongdoer by afflicting someone close to them, and Pasiphae's suffering was entirely the result of Poseidon's anger at her husband, not anything she herself had done. Desperate and humiliated by feelings she could not control or explain, Pasiphae turned, according to the myth, to Daedalus for help. And here we see the first hint of the craftsman's genius being put toward something profoundly strange. Daedalus built her a hollow wooden cow, covered in real hide, so lifelike and so cleverly constructed that Pasiphae could conceal herself inside it and approach the bull without being recognized as human. The details of what followed are ones the ancient sources handle briefly and without much elaboration, and I will do the same, because the point of the story was never meant to linger there. What matters for us is the result. 9 months later, Pasiphae gave birth to a child unlike any that had ever been born on Crete or anywhere else. A boy with the body of a human and the head of a bull. The Greeks called him Asterion, though history remembers him almost entirely by a different name, the Minotaur, which simply means in ancient Greek, the bull of Minos. Imagine, for a moment, being a palace attendant on the day that child was born. Imagine the hushed, frightened conversations that must have passed between servants who caught only a glimpse before the doors were closed. Imagine Minos himself standing in a doorway, staring at a creature that was somehow his wife's son, and yet nothing he could ever acknowledge as his own, a living reminder of a broken promise to a god who did not forgive broken promises easily. As the Minotaur grew, the stories tell us he grew fierce and increasingly difficult to control, developing a hunger for human flesh that made him not just an embarrassment to hide, but a genuine danger to keep anywhere near ordinary people. Minos needed somewhere to put him, somewhere secure enough that the creature could never escape, and confusing enough that anyone who wandered in searching for him would become hopelessly lost long before they ever found their way back out. And so the king turned, once again, to the one man on the island whose mind seemed capable of building almost anything. He turned to Daedalus and asked him to design a prison unlike any that had existed before. What Daedalus built, according to the old accounts, was the Labyrinth. Not simply a maze in the sense we might picture today, a garden hedge puzzle meant for pleasant confusion on a summer afternoon, but something far more deliberate and far more disturbing. A structure of winding passages folding endlessly back on themselves, corridors that appeared identical from every angle, dead ends that led travelers in circles until they lost all sense of direction, all sense of time, all sense of which way led back toward daylight. The ancient poet Ovid describes it as a work so intricate that even Daedalus himself, its own architect, nearly became confused within its turns while testing his design. Imagine that for a moment. A man so skilled at building confusion that his own creation nearly swallowed him. I want you to picture the construction of this place, because I think it deserves more attention than most versions of the story give it. Imagine teams of laborers, hundreds of them most likely, working under Daedalus's direction for what must have been months, possibly years. Quarrying stone from the hills around Knossos, hauling it by ox cart and by sheer human muscle to the construction site. The rhythmic sound of chisels against limestone, echoing across a work site from dawn until the light failed each evening. Overseers calling out measurements, correcting angles, checking that each new passage matched precisely the strange, deliberate design Daedalus had worked out, probably on wax tablets or scratched into clay, sketching corridors that seemed to lead nowhere on purpose. There would have been arguments, surely, among the workers, about why any structure needed to be built this way, with turns that seemed to serve no practical purpose, walls positioned specifically to disorient rather than to shelter. Some of them likely never learned the true purpose of what they were building, kept in the dark quite literally about the creature the maze was meant to contain. Only a small circle close to the king would have known the full truth. Everyone else simply followed instructions, laid stone upon stone, and went home each evening to families who probably asked, over dinner, what exactly they had spent the day constructing, and received answers that satisfied no one's curiosity. And when it was finished, the Minotaur was led into the deepest recesses of that structure, and the entrance was sealed in such a way that only those who truly understood its design, meaning essentially only Daedalus himself, could reliably navigate its interior and return alive. Now here is where our story begins to turn toward something even darker, because a creature that ate human flesh required feeding, and Minos found a source for that feeding in the cities he had brought under his power through war, and through the strength of his navy. Athens, in particular, had suffered a defeat at the hands of Crete years earlier, and as part of the resulting tribute, Athens was required to send a group of young men and women, 7 of each according to most versions, to Crete every 9 years, where they would be led into the Labyrinth and left there for the Minotaur to find. This is the tribute that Theseus, the young Athenian prince, would eventually volunteer to join, determined to end the cycle by killing the Minotaur himself, a story we told in full some time ago on this channel, if you want to go back and listen to it after tonight. And it was Daedalus, once again, whose cleverness became central to that story too, because it was Daedalus who gave Ariadne, the king's own daughter, the idea of a simple ball of thread, unspooled behind Theseus as he walked deeper into the maze, so that afterward he could follow it back out into the daylight, having accomplished what no one else who entered that place had ever managed to do. That single act, helping the enemies of Crete defeat the king's own monstrous creation, would cost Daedalus everything he had built on the island. When Minos discovered what his own craftsman had done, discovered that the same mind which had built the prison had also handed its secret to the very people it was meant to contain, his fury was, understandably, absolute. And this is the moment our story truly begins, because Minos did not simply punish Daedalus. He locked him away, along with his young son Icarus, inside the one place on the entire island that Daedalus himself had made impossible to escape, the Labyrinth. Let's sit with that for a moment before we move forward, because I think it is one of the most quietly devastating details in the entire myth. A man builds a trap so perfect that no one can find their way out of it, and then his own creation becomes the place where he and his child are condemned to disappear. Let's go inside that tower now and see what those days were actually like. Life inside the WALLS, the ancient sources are not entirely consistent about exactly where Daedalus and Icarus were confined. Some versions say they were shut inside the labyrinth itself, left among its endless turning corridors. Other versions, including the one most people picture today, describe a tower, a single high structure built along the northern coast of Crete, close enough to the sea that the sound of waves would have reached them through whatever narrow windows the tower allowed. I find this second version easier to hold in the mind, easier to imagine in detail, so that is the version we will follow tonight, though I want you to know that both existed side by side in the ancient retellings, each one shaped by a different storyteller reaching for a different kind of image. Imagine, then, a tower of pale stone standing near a stretch of rocky coastline, tall enough to catch the wind in a way the lower buildings of the palace never did. From its highest windows, if the guards allowed any windows at all, you might have been able to see the water stretching out toward the horizon, blue in the mornings, and deepening toward something almost the color of wine as evening came on. This was, in its own way, a strange kind of prison. Not a dark, damp cell of the sort we might picture from later centuries, but a place with air and light and a view of the sea, and somehow that made it worse in certain ways, because freedom was visible from every window and utterly out of reach. Minos, according to the myth, had ordered the coastline itself watched. Every ship that came near Crete's shores was searched, every departing vessel checked carefully, because the king understood that Daedalus's mind was the true danger, far more than his hands. A man that clever could bribe a sailor, could stow away in the hold of a merchant ship, could talk his way free using nothing but words. So Minos closed off the sea as thoroughly as he had closed off the land, believing that a craftsman famous for building his way out of any problem would finally find himself with no way out at all. I want you to imagine what the days inside that tower actually looked like, because this is the part of the story almost every version skips entirely, rushing straight from imprisonment to escape as though no time passed at all in between. But time did pass. Weeks most likely, perhaps longer, during which a father and a son lived together in close confinement, waiting, watching the sea, and slowly working out what to do. Icarus, in most tellings, was still quite young. Not a small child, but not yet a grown man either, somewhere in that stretch of adolescence where a boy has enough understanding to grasp the seriousness of danger, but not yet enough life experience to fully weigh consequences the way an older person might. Imagine him in those early days of imprisonment, restless the way any young person confined to a small space quickly becomes, pacing the length of the tower room, running his fingers along the rough stone of the walls, tracing the mortar lines out of pure boredom, sitting by whatever narrow window they had been allowed, watching gulls wheel and dive over the water below, envying, probably without even fully realizing he was envying it, the effortless freedom of their movement. Meals would have come at set times, brought by guards under Minos's orders. Simple food pushed through whatever narrow opening the tower's design allowed. Bread probably stale more often than fresh, since fresh bread required daily baking, and there was little incentive for the palace kitchens to trouble themselves over prisoners. Dried fish, olives, watered wine, the same staples that fed most ordinary Cretans, just delivered with less care and less warmth than a free household might have offered. Imagine the particular sound of a wooden tray being set down outside a locked door, followed by retreating footsteps, followed by silence, followed by the scrape of the tray being pulled inside through whatever gap existed for that purpose. Daedalus, we can imagine, would not have simply sat idle through these days. A mind like his rarely does. He would have paced too, but with purpose, studying the walls not out of boredom but out of calculation, running his hands along the stone the way an engineer studies a problem, looking for weaknesses, for gaps, for anything that might suggest a path forward. He would have watched the guards' routines, noting when they changed shifts, how closely they checked the tower each evening, whether there were moments of inattention that might be exploited. But the more he studied the situation, the clearer it must have become that there truly was no way out by land or by sea. Minos had thought this through thoroughly. Every road was watched. Every ship was searched. A man could not simply walk or sail his way to freedom when the entire island's resources were dedicated to preventing exactly that outcome. And it was in this stretch of frustrated, careful observation, so the story goes, that Daedalus began watching something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with roads or ships. He began watching the birds. I want you to imagine this moment slowly, because it is the true beginning of everything that follows. Picture Daedalus standing at that narrow tower window, morning after morning, watching gulls rise from the rocks below on currents of air, watching them tilt their wings almost imperceptibly to catch a gust, and rise higher without a single flap, watching them glide for long stretches with barely any visible effort at all. Most people, watching birds fly, see only beauty, only the ordinary miracle of something moving through open air. Daedalus, watching those same birds, began to see mechanics. He began to see the actual physical structure that made flight possible, the layered feathers, the way larger feathers near the body gave way to smaller, more flexible ones toward the tips of the wings, the particular curve and angle that let air lift a body that would otherwise simply fall. This is worth pausing on, because it tells us something important about how Daedalus's mind worked, and honestly about how a certain kind of inventive genius has always worked, whether in ancient Crete or in workshops much closer to our own time. He did not look at an impossible problem, a locked tower on a heavily guarded island, and think only about doors and locks and guards. He looked past the obvious obstacles entirely and began to ask a much stranger, much larger question. What if the ground itself was not the only way to travel? What if the sky, which no king could search and no soldier could patrol, might actually be the one road left completely open? It must have seemed at first like an idle thought, the kind of fantasy a caged mind reaches for simply to pass the hours. Men did not fly. No one in the entire history of the world, as far as anyone in that tower knew, had ever flown. But Daedalus was not the kind of man who dismissed an idea simply because it had never been done before. If anything, the fact that it had never been done seemed to make it more interesting to him, not less. So he began to collect feathers. Where did they come from? All those feathers a man would eventually need to build 2 functioning sets of wings. The most common version of the story says that gulls and other seabirds nested along the rocky coast near the tower, and that Daedalus, watching them come and go, began quietly gathering the feathers they shed naturally, and eventually, perhaps, feathers from birds he managed to catch or that guards, not understanding the purpose, allowed him to keep as some small mercy toward a prisoner who seemed harmless enough occupying his hands with something to do. Imagine him at the window each morning, patient in a way that must have looked almost eerie to anyone watching, reaching out to gather a stray feather caught in the crevice of the stone, examining it closely, setting it carefully aside in a growing collection that no guard at first thought to question. And imagine Icarus in those early days, watching his father with a mixture of confusion and slowly dawning fascination. What is he doing? Why does he care so much about feathers? Is this simply the strange, restless behavior of a mind grown desperate under confinement, or is something else beginning to take shape? It would not take long before the boy understood exactly what his father intended. And it would not take much longer after that before both of them were working together, side by side, on the most audacious project either of them had ever attempted. Let's go inside that workshop now, such as it was, and watch two sets of wings slowly come into being. The building of the wings there is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a workspace when someone is doing careful, exacting labor. And I imagine that quiet settled over that tower room during the weeks Daedalus spent constructing the wings. Not silence exactly, because there would have been sound, the soft rustle of feathers being sorted and arranged, the occasional scrape of a knife trimming a quill to the right length, low murmured conversation between father and son as Daedalus explained what he was doing and why. But a particular focused stillness, the kind that comes when a task demands your whole attention and leaves no room for anything else. Ovid, writing centuries after the events he describes, gives us the fullest surviving account of how the wings were actually built, and it is worth walking through his description slowly, because the process he describes is genuinely clever, the kind of solution that feels almost obvious once you hear it explained, even though no one before Daedalus in the world of the myth had ever thought to attempt it. Daedalus began, according to this account, by arranging feathers in careful rows, starting with the smallest at what would become the tip of each wing, and progressing to larger and larger feathers as the structure moved toward what would become the shoulder. This mirrors, quite precisely, the actual structure of a real bird's wing, where flight feathers are indeed arranged from small to large, moving from the wingtip inward, a detail that suggests whoever first told this story, whether it was Ovid himself or an earlier poet he was drawing from, had spent real time studying birds closely enough to notice. I want you to picture the materials themselves for a moment, because touch matters in a story like this, and I do not think we spend nearly enough time imagining what things actually felt like in the hands of the people who made them. Feathers, even from large seabirds, are lighter than most people expect the first time they hold one, almost weightless, with a central quill that feels rigid and slightly ridged between the fingers, tapering toward the tip into something soft enough to bend without breaking. Sorting hundreds of these by size, by curve, by the particular stiffness of each one, would have been slow, meticulous work, the kind that strains the eyes after an hour and leaves fingertips slightly numb from repetitive handling. To hold the feathers together, Daedalus used two different methods depending on their position on the wing. Smaller feathers near the tips, according to Ovid's account, were bound together using linen thread, wound carefully around the base of each quill and tied off in small, tight knots. Larger feathers closer to the body were fixed in place using wax, heated until it went soft and pliable, then pressed carefully around the base of each feather to hold it firmly against the wooden frame beneath. Now, where did the wax come from? Beeswax was common throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, used for everything from sealing wine jars to coating the wooden tablets scribes wrote on before erasing their notes and starting fresh. A prisoner in a tower, even one closely watched, might reasonably have had access to a small supply of wax candles for light after dark, and Daedalus, ever resourceful, would have found a way to gather and repurpose whatever wax he could obtain, melting it slowly over whatever small flame the tower allowed, watching it turn from solid to liquid to a workable, honey-colored substance, he could shape with his fingers before it hardened again. Imagine the smell of that melting wax filling the small stone room, sweet and slightly smoky, mixing with the drier, earthier smell of feathers and the faint mustiness of stone that had absorbed centuries of sea air. Imagine the warmth of it against Daedalus's fingertips as he worked quickly before it cooled, pressing feather after feather into place, checking the angle of each one against its neighbors, occasionally pausing to hold the growing wing up toward the light from the window, turning it slowly, studying the way the feathers overlapped like scales on a fish, like shingles on a roof, each layer slightly covering the one beneath it so that no gap in the surface would let air slip uselessly through. For the frame itself, most versions describe a light wooden structure, likely made from reeds or thin, flexible branches bent into the curved shape of an actual wing, strong enough to hold its form under the pressure of moving air, but light enough that a person could actually lift and move it without exhausting themselves before ever leaving the ground. This would have required its own careful experimentation, testing different woods, different thicknesses, bending green wood perhaps and letting it dry into the correct curve, or steaming it over hot water to make it pliable enough to shape by hand, a technique craftsmen across many ancient cultures understood well. I want you to imagine the two of them working through this process together, and I think it is worth spending real time on their relationship here, father and son laboring side by side on something neither of them fully knew would work. Icarus, we can imagine, would have been given tasks suited to his age and his hands, perhaps sorting feathers by size while his father handled the more delicate work of binding them in place, perhaps holding sections of the frame steady while wax cooled and set, perhaps simply watching, asking questions, the kind of endless curious questions a young person asks when watching a skilled parent work through a difficult problem. Why this size feather here and not there? Why does the wax need to be this warm and no warmer? What happens if the wind catches the wing wrong? And imagine Daedalus, patient in his answers despite the tension of the situation, despite the knowledge that failure here meant remaining trapped in that tower for the rest of both their lives, or worse. There is something quietly moving about picturing a father teaching his son the mechanics of something as impossible as flight, while both of them sat imprisoned by a furious king, using nothing but scavenged feathers and melted candle wax, and whatever bent wood they could gather, working entirely by instinct and careful observation, because no one before them had ever needed to solve this particular problem. The work would not have gone smoothly the entire time. Imagine early attempts that failed, feathers bound at the wrong angle that caught the air poorly, wax applied too thickly in places, adding weight without adding strength, wooden frames that flexed too much or too little when tested by hand. We can imagine frustrated afternoons, feathers scattered across the stone floor after some experiment had to be taken apart and started over, Daedalus running his hands through his hair the way people do, when a problem refuses to yield, Icarus perhaps growing restless or discouraged, wondering aloud whether any of this would actually work, whether they were simply wasting the last weeks of their freedom on an impossible dream. But slowly, over what the stories suggest was a period of weeks, the wings took shape. 2 full sets, one sized for a grown man and one sized for a boy not yet finished growing, each one a careful architecture of feather and wax and bent wood, each one representing hundreds of small, exacting decisions made by two people who had never seen anything like what they were building, working from nothing but observation of birds and an unshakable belief that the sky, unlike the sea and the roads, remained entirely unguarded. When the wings were finally finished, I imagine there would have been a moment of quiet awe inside that tower room. Two pairs of wings, laid out across the stone floor or perhaps hung carefully from pegs along the wall, catching the light from the window in a way that must have seemed almost otherworldly. Feathers arranged in perfect overlapping rows, the particular golden sheen of hardened wax visible where it held the larger feathers in place. And underneath all of that beauty, an enormous, terrifying question that neither of them could answer until the moment finally came to test it. Would these actually work? Would this collection of scavenged materials, held together by nothing more than heated wax and careful craftsmanship, actually be strong enough, light enough, precisely shaped enough, to carry a human body up off the ground and out over open water? There was only one way to find out, and that moment was coming closer with every passing day. Let's slow down even further now, because the next part of this story, the part just before they finally leave that tower, deserves to be told with real care. The warning before Daedalus and his son ever stepped off the edge of that tower and trusted their weight to the open air. There was a conversation that has echoed through nearly 3,000 years of retelling, repeated in classrooms and sermons and casual conversation, so often that most people know its message even if they have never read a single line of the original poem it comes from. I want to slow all the way down here, because I think the speed at which most people hear this part of the story does it a real disservice. Ovid describes Daedalus fitting the wings onto his son's shoulders and arms with his own hands, adjusting the straps, checking the fit the way any parent checks the fit of new clothing on a growing child. And as he did this, according to the poem, tears fell from the old craftsman's eyes and his hands trembled slightly with the work. I want you to sit with that image for a moment. A father kneeling or standing close before his son, fastening wings made from stolen feathers and melted wax onto the boy's shoulders, weeping even as his hands continued the careful, practiced work of a craftsman who could not allow emotion to interfere with precision, because precision here meant the difference between flight and disaster. And then came the words. "Fly the middle course," Daedalus told his son. "Not so low that the sea spray dampens your feathers and drags you down into the water, but not so high that the sun's heat softens the wax holding everything together. Follow me closely. Watch where I go and match my path exactly. Do not let the wonder of what we are doing distract you into recklessness." I think it is worth pausing here to notice something that gets lost in the shorthand version of this warning most people carry around in their heads. The common version, the one repeated so often it has become almost a cliché, focuses entirely on the danger of flying too high, too close to the sun. But the original warning was about balance in both directions. Too low was just as dangerous as too high. The sea itself could kill you just as surely as the sun could, simply through a different mechanism, water soaking heavy into feathers rather than wax melting away entirely. Daedalus was not warning his son away from ambition alone. He was warning him toward moderation itself. toward the careful, measured middle path that had guided Daedalus's own long career as a craftsman who understood, better than almost anyone, the exact point where confidence tips over into carelessness. Imagine Icarus listening to these words, nodding along the way any child nods along to a parent's careful instructions, genuinely intending to follow them, and yet not truly grasping, not the way his father grasped it after decades of hard-won experience, just how easily excitement can erase caution once your feet actually leave solid ground. There is something universal in this moment that I think explains why the story has survived so long and traveled so far beyond its original context. Every parent who has ever tried to warn a child about a danger the child cannot yet fully understand will recognize something of themselves in Daedalus, kneeling there with trembling hands, trying to compress a lifetime of hard-earned caution into a few sentences delivered in the last quiet moments before letting a child step out into a world the parent can no longer fully control. And every person who has ever been young enough to nod along to good advice while quietly believing, somewhere underneath the nodding, that the warning surely could not apply quite so strictly to them, will recognize something of themselves in Icarus. According to the ancient account, Daedalus embraced his son once the wings were fully fitted, and in that embrace, the poem tells us, his face was wet with tears he could not fully hold back. It is a small, human detail buried inside a story that is often told as though it were pure spectacle, wings and sun, and a dramatic fall, and I think it deserves to be remembered just as clearly as any of that. This was, before it was anything else, a father saying goodbye to the version of his son who had never yet flown, uncertain whether the boy who came back down, if he came back down at all, would be the same one who had just stepped up onto that ledge. There would have been a final check of the wings, I imagine, in the quiet after that embrace. Daedalus running his hands once more along the feathers, checking the wax had held firm through the fitting, that no gaps had opened where a careless movement might catch the wind wrong. Icarus, for his part, would have felt the unfamiliar weight of the wings settling across his shoulders and down his arms, a sensation unlike anything either of them had ever experienced, the strange combination of heaviness and potential, of something that felt cumbersome standing still and yet promised, if the theory held, to become almost weightless the moment it caught the open air. And beyond the tower window, the sea stretched out toward the horizon, calm that morning, according to most tellings, calm enough that the light would have caught the water in long, shifting bands of blue and silver, calm enough that gulls still wheeled and dove along the coastline exactly as they had every morning of the imprisonment, utterly indifferent to the fact that two humans were about to attempt, for the first time in the history of the world as that world understood itself, to join them in the open air. Let's go inside that final morning now, slowly, before we watch them finally leave the ground. Leaving the ground, imagine the very first moment Daedalus stepped toward the edge, the wings spread wide on either side of him, catching the light of a Mediterranean morning already warm against his skin. There is no way to know exactly how he chose that first instant, how he judged the wind, how he decided that this particular breath of air moving across the coastline was the one worth trusting his entire body to. Perhaps he had spent the previous days simply testing, small experimental jumps from a lower ledge, feeling the wings catch and lift slightly before setting his feet back down on solid stone, building confidence the way any careful craftsman tests a bridge before letting others walk across it. And then, at some point, testing was no longer enough, and only the real attempt would answer the question that had consumed every hour of the past several weeks. He stepped off the edge. I want you to imagine the sensation of that first moment of true flight, as best as we can reconstruct it from a position none of us have ever actually experienced ourselves. The sudden absence of solid ground beneath your feet. A drop, perhaps only a few feet at first, terrifyingly fast, before the wings caught the moving air and something shifted entirely. The wind pressing up against the underside of feathers arranged with such careful precision weeks earlier, the frame flexing slightly under the new pressure, and then, astonishingly, lift. The sensation of being held, however briefly, by nothing but moving air and the shape of two wings built from stolen feathers and melted wax. According to the myth, Daedalus tested the wings first, flying a short distance to confirm the design actually worked before returning briefly to fetch his son and begin the real journey together. Imagine the relief and the terror mixed together in that moment. The joy of discovering that years of careful observation of birds had actually translated into something real, something that worked, combined with the immediate, sobering awareness that the hardest part, trusting his own child's life to this same untested invention, still lay ahead. Icarus stepped off the ledge next, and I imagine the sensation for him would have been entirely different in character, even if the physical mechanics were identical. Where his father carried decades of hard-won caution into that first drop, weighing every gust of wind against the memory of countless failed experiments and careful calculations, Icarus carried something closer to pure astonishment. Imagine the sheer, overwhelming wonder of a boy who had spent weeks confined to a single tower room, watching birds through a narrow window with nothing but envy, suddenly finding himself among them. The sea spread out far below in a way he had never once imagined seeing it, the coastline of Crete shrinking behind him with every beat of his own two borrowed wings. They flew together at first, according to the story, father leading and son following closely behind, exactly as instructed. Picture the two of them moving out over open water, the island of Crete falling away beneath them, its pale coastline and terraced hillsides growing smaller and smaller, until the entire shape of the land they had been imprisoned on for so many weeks became visible all at once, something Icarus had never been able to see from inside that tower. An entire island reduced to something you could hold in a single glance. Below them, fishermen out in small boats looked up and saw something they could not explain, two figures moving through open sky with wings spread wide. And according to the old poets, some of them dropped their fishing lines entirely in shock. Others called out to shepherds working on distant hillsides, pointing upward, certain they were witnessing gods descending from Olympus rather than two mortal men who had simply solved, through patient observation and careful craftsmanship, a problem no human being had ever solved before. I think this detail matters enormously, and I want to sit with it for a moment. The ancient audience hearing this story understood something we sometimes forget when we retell it today. Flight, at this point in the myth, had never happened before. There was no context for it. A shepherd looking up and seeing two winged figures moving across the sky had no framework for understanding what he was seeing except through the lens of divinity, because human beings, as far as anyone in that world understood, simply did not do this. Daedalus and Icarus were not just escaping a tower. They were doing something that shattered the entire understood boundary between what humans could and could not do, and the wonder that provoked, both in the story and presumably in whatever real human capacity for astonishment inspired the story in the first place, deserves to be felt fully rather than rushed past. They passed over islands as they flew. Ovid names several of them, Samos and Delos and Labyrinthos among others, small pieces of land scattered across the Aegean that would have appeared beneath them as pale smudges against the deep blue of the sea, growing larger and then smaller again as the two flyers passed steadily northward, gaining confidence with every mile that passed safely beneath them. And it was somewhere in the midst of that growing confidence, according to the story, that something in Icarus began to shift. Imagine the particular psychology of that moment. A boy who had spent weeks in fearful confinement, who had just discovered, more thoroughly and more joyfully than perhaps any human being before him, the sheer exhilaration of flight, beginning to notice that nothing bad had happened yet. The wings held. The wax stayed firm. Mile after mile passed safely by, and with every safe mile, the careful warning his father had given him back in that tower room. Fly the middle course. Do not go too high. Do not go too low, would have begun to feel in the boy's mind, less like an urgent rule, and more like an overly cautious suggestion given by a parent who perhaps did not fully appreciate just how well this whole endeavor was actually going. This is, I think, one of the most quietly universal moments in the entire story, and it is worth resisting the urge to judge Icarus too harshly for what happens next. Nearly everyone, at some point in their life, has experienced this exact psychological shift. A careful warning, delivered by someone with more experience, taken seriously at first, only to gradually feel less urgent as things continue going well, until confidence tips over into something closer to carelessness, without the person experiencing it even fully noticing the shift happening in real time. Icarus began to climb higher. Let's slow down even further here, because this is the part of the story that has echoed across nearly 3,000 years for a reason, and it deserves to be told with real patience rather than rushed toward its ending. Too close to the sun, I want you to imagine the sensation of climbing higher on wings that had never been tested at these altitudes. The air growing thinner and cooler around Icarus, even as the sun itself, paradoxically, seemed to press warmer and closer against his skin the higher he rose. Ovid describes the boy growing bold with the joy of flight, delighting in the freedom of it, pulling further and further away from the safer, steadier course his father maintained below him. Imagine the particular thrill of that boldness, the specific joy of a young person discovering, seemingly for the first time, that his own body could do something extraordinary, something his father himself had only recently learned to do, and feeling, in that discovery, an intoxicating sense of his own capability that made caution feel almost insulting to entertain. Down below, at what the story describes as the safer, middle altitude his father maintained. Daedalus glanced up and saw his son climbing steadily away from him, and I imagined the specific quality of fear that must have gripped him in that moment. A fear made sharper by the fact that he alone, among everyone present that morning, truly understood the mechanism by which the wings could fail. He alone had melted that wax with his own hands. He alone understood precisely how warm it needed to become before it would begin to soften, before the careful binding holding each feather in place would begin, slowly and then catastrophically, to give way. Imagine him calling out, his voice carried away and thinned by the wind at that altitude, "Icarus, come back, come down. You are flying too high." Imagine the particular helplessness of that call. A father who had solved the impossible problem of human flight, suddenly discovering that inventing the wings had been, in some sense, the easier problem, compared to now trying to control, from a distance, the choices of a child intoxicated with a freedom neither of them had ever previously imagined. The sun, according to every version of this myth, was the true danger, not because ancient audiences believed the sun itself was close enough to physically scorch a person the way a nearby flame would, but because the heat radiating downward, intensifying the higher Icarus climbed, was enough to begin softening the wax that held the feathers of his wings together. I think it is worth pausing on the actual mechanics of this failure for a moment, because it is a detail almost perfectly designed, whether by accident or through some genuinely careful ancient understanding of how wax behaves under heat, to feel both mythic and eerily plausible at the same time. Wax softens gradually, not all at once. It would not have failed in a single dramatic instant. It would have begun, most likely, with the smallest feathers, the ones near the tips of the wings bound with linen thread, and requiring less structural wax to hold in place, working loose first, drifting away from the wing structure one at a time, nearly invisible against the pale sky, easy to miss until enough of them had gone that the wing's shape itself had begun subtly, dangerously, to change. Imagine Icarus, still climbing, still caught up in the sheer exhilaration of the moment, beginning to notice something wrong only gradually. A slight change in the way the air moved past his arms. A faint, sweet smell, the smell of warm wax, carried on the wind around him in a way it had not been during the earlier, cooler stretches of the flight. Perhaps a single feather, catching his eye as it drifted loose and spun slowly downward past his shoulder, a small, strange thing to notice at first, easy to dismiss, until a second feather followed it, and then a third. And then, according to Ovid's account, the boy felt his arms losing their grip on the air itself. Not a sudden plummet at first, but a growing, sickening awareness that the wings were no longer holding him the way they had only moments before, that each beat of his arms produced less lift than the beat before it, that the careful architecture of feather and wax his father had built so painstakingly, back in that tower room weeks earlier, was coming apart around him piece by piece. I want you to imagine the specific terror of that realization, a boy suddenly understanding, with total clarity and far too late to change course, exactly what his father's warning had actually meant. Not an abstract caution delivered by an overly careful parent, but a precise, mechanical description of a real physical failure that was now, in this exact moment, happening to him personally, high above open water, with no ground beneath him and no father close enough to reach him in time. Ovid tells us that Icarus called out to his father as he fell, and that his voice was swallowed by the sea before Daedalus, looking around desperately for his son and finding only empty sky where the boy had been only moments before, could do anything at all to help him. Imagine Daedalus's eyes searching the air above and around him, calling his son's name over and over, the particular horror of a parent's voice going unanswered, and then, finally, looking downward and seeing feathers scattered across the surface of the water below, drifting on the waves, the unmistakable remains of wings that had carried a boy joyfully through open sky only minutes before, now simply floating, useless, across a stretch of sea that had swallowed everything else. The old stories do not linger long on the moment of Icarus actually striking the water. Perhaps that mercy was deliberate, even in the earliest versions of the myth, a recognition that some moments are better left to the listener's imagination than described in exhaustive, painful detail. What they tell us instead is what came after. A father, still airborne, still held aloft by wings identical in construction to the ones that had just failed his son, forced to watch from above as the sea closed over the place where Icarus had disappeared, with absolutely nothing he could do to change what had already happened. I want us to sit with this for a moment quietly before we move forward into what came next, because I think this is the emotional center of the entire story, more than the wings themselves, more than the flight, more even than the fall. A father who had spent his whole life solving problems other people considered impossible, who had built an escape from an inescapable prison using nothing but feathers and wax and patient observation, discovering in this single, terrible moment that some things, once set into motion, cannot be solved, cannot be fixed, cannot be undone by even the cleverest hands in the ancient world. Let's go inside that grief now carefully, because it deserves to be told with real tenderness. What the sea kept there is a particular kind of silence that follows a loss too sudden and too total to fully comprehend in the moment it happens. And I imagine that silence settled over Daedalus almost immediately, even as his body continued the automatic, mechanical work of staying airborne, wings still beating, still catching the wind exactly as they had been built to do. Grief in these earliest moments often arrives alongside a strange kind of numbness, the mind refusing at first to fully process what the eyes have just witnessed. And I imagine Daedalus circling lower over the water where his son had disappeared, scanning the waves for some sign, some possibility that what he had just seen was not truly final. The old accounts tell us he found only feathers, scattered and drifting across the surface of the sea, along with, presumably, whatever remained of the wooden frame that had once held those feathers in careful, deliberate rows. No sign of his son himself. The water in that part of the Aegean, according to most tellings, simply closed over the boy and kept him, offering no body to recover, no final moment of physical farewell, nothing but empty, indifferent waves stretching out in every direction beneath a sky that continued being beautiful, continued being calm, entirely unmoved by what had just happened within it. I want you to imagine the particular cruelty of that indifference, because I think it is a detail worth sitting with honestly rather than rushing past. Grief often arrives alongside a kind of bewildered anger at the world's refusal to pause, to acknowledge, to change in response to a loss that feels, to the person experiencing it, large enough to reshape everything. The sea did not darken. The sun did not dim. Other birds continued wheeling and diving along the coastline exactly as they had that morning, utterly unaware that anything of consequence had occurred at all. Daedalus, alone now in a sky he had only recently learned to inhabit, would have had to somehow continue flying, continue navigating, continue making the physical decisions required to stay aloft, all while carrying a grief that must have felt, in that moment, heavy enough to pull him down into the water alongside his son. According to the myth, Daedalus eventually landed on a nearby island, and it is here that one of the most quietly devastating details of the entire story emerges. The island where he came ashore, some versions say, was the same one near where his son had fallen, and Daedalus, according to these accounts, searched the shoreline and the shallows until he finally found what the sea had, after all, chosen to release. The body of his son, washed up eventually along the coast, close enough for a grieving father to finally hold what remained of the child he had built wings for only weeks before. Imagine that moment of recovery, if we allow ourselves to imagine it at all. A father kneeling on a rocky shoreline, the sound of waves continuing their endless, indifferent rhythm behind him, gathering his son's body from the shallow water, feathers perhaps still clinging here and there to skin and clothing, the last physical remnants of an invention that had promised freedom and delivered. Instead, an ending neither of them could have fully prepared for despite every careful warning given in that tower room weeks earlier. The ancient sources tell us that Daedalus buried his son on that island, and that the island itself from that day forward carried the boy's name. Icaria it came to be called, a modest, mountainous piece of land in the eastern Aegean that still exists today, still inhabited, still visited by travelers who arrive knowing, at least vaguely, the story attached to its name. And the surrounding waters became known as the Icarian Sea, a name that persisted through Greek antiquity, through Roman rule, through Byzantine centuries, and survives even now on modern maps, one of the longest-running memorials in human history, a stretch of open water carrying, quietly, the memory of a single tragic flight that supposedly happened somewhere within it more than 3,000 years ago. I find something genuinely moving in the fact that this naming persisted for so long, across so many different cultures and centuries and languages, each one inheriting the story anew and choosing, generation after generation, to keep that name rather than let it fade into some more practical, less storied label. There is something in human nature, it seems, that resists letting certain losses disappear entirely, that insists on marking them somehow, permanently in the landscape itself, so that anyone sailing those waters centuries later, even without knowing the full story, might sense that something significant, something worth remembering had happened here. Local tradition on the actual island of Icaria today, for what it is worth, includes references to a small headland or a particular stretch of coast, sometimes pointed to as the traditional site of the boy's burial. Though I want to be honest with you here, because this is a place where myth and modern tourism blend together in ways that are genuinely difficult to untangle. And no serious historian would claim we can identify with any real certainty an exact physical location tied to events that likely never happened in the literal sense the myth describes. What we can say is that people have been telling this story and attaching it to this specific stretch of sea and this specific island for an extraordinarily long time, long enough that the geography itself became inseparable from the story, each reinforcing the other across centuries of retelling. I think it is worth pausing here, in this quiet moment of grief, to consider something about how ancient Greek audiences would have understood this ending, because it differs somewhat from how a modern audience might initially receive it. To a modern listener, raised on stories that often reward risk-taking and celebrate bold ambition, Icarus's death can read almost like a harsh, disproportionate punishment for what was, after all, simply the enthusiasm of youth, a boy getting swept up in the joy of an experience no human had ever had before him. But to an ancient Greek audience, steeped in a cultural framework that placed enormous value on the concept the Greeks called sophrosyne, a kind of measured self-restraint and awareness of one's proper limits, the story would have carried a somewhat different weight. Icarus's fall was not simply bad luck. It was understood as a natural, almost inevitable consequence of exceeding the boundaries appropriate to a mortal, of forgetting, in the intoxication of a genuinely extraordinary gift, that gifts of this magnitude come bundled with responsibilities and limits that cannot be ignored without consequence. And yet, I do not think the ancient tellings of this story were ever purely a moral lecture dressed up in mythic clothing. There is too much tenderness in the surviving accounts, too much attention paid to Daedalus's tears, to his trembling hands fitting the wings, to his desperate calls across open sky, for this story to function only as a warning against overreaching ambition. It reads, and has always read, as a genuine tragedy, one where the audience is meant to feel, alongside whatever moral lesson might be drawn from it, the simple, aching weight of a parent losing a child, and a child losing his life in the exact moment he had finally discovered what it felt like to be truly, completely free. Let's stay with Daedalus a little longer, because his story did not end on that grieving shoreline, even though some part of him, I suspect, never truly left it. The flight that continued after burying his son, Daedalus took to the air once more, and I want you to imagine the particular weight of that decision. A grieving father putting the very wings that had just killed his child back onto his own shoulders and trusting them again with the rest of the journey. What choice did he truly have? He was still, technically, a fugitive from the wrath of King Minos, still a man whose safety depended on putting as much distance as possible between himself and Crete, and the sky, whatever grief it now carried for him, remained the one route across the sea that no ship of Minos could follow or intercept. The stories tell us he flew onward, west and north, away from the islands where his son now lay buried, eventually reaching the island of Sicily, where he found refuge at the court of a local king named Cocalus. Imagine the particular exhaustion of that final stretch of flight, A man not just physically tired from hours spent airborne, but carrying a grief heavy enough to make every wing beat feel like an act of will rather than instinct. Imagine him finally sighting the coastline of Sicily after however many hours or days the journey required, and the strange, hollow relief of arriving somewhere safe at last, with no one left beside him to share that relief. King Cocalus, according to the myth, welcomed Daedalus warmly, recognizing immediately the value of sheltering a craftsman whose reputation had clearly traveled well ahead of him across the Mediterranean world. Daedalus, the stories tell us, went on to build remarkable things during his time in Sicily. A pool with water heated by some clever underground mechanism, warm enough to bathe in without any visible fire. Elaborate honeycombed structures of gold, so delicately worked that the metal itself seemed to have been poured directly into shape rather than hammered or cast through any conventional method. A fortress built atop a cliff so steep and so cleverly designed that it could reportedly be defended by just a handful of men against any invading force, its narrow approach forcing attackers to climb single file into range of defenders waiting above. Meanwhile, back in Crete, Minos had not forgotten the craftsman who had escaped his supposedly inescapable prison, and the myth tells us that the furious king spent years actively searching for Daedalus, determined to bring him to justice for both his earlier betrayal involving the ball of thread and his subsequent, impossible escape from the tower. Minos, according to this part of the story, eventually devised a clever test to help identify his fugitive craftsman wherever he might be hiding. He traveled from city to city, kingdom to kingdom, carrying with him a single spiral seashell, and offering a substantial reward to anyone who could successfully thread a piece of string entirely through its winding interior chambers, a task that seemed almost impossible using any straightforward method. Precisely the kind of clever puzzle that only a mind like Daedalus's would know how to solve. When Minos eventually arrived in Sicily and presented this same challenge at the court of King Cocalus, Daedalus, unable to resist the pull of a genuinely clever problem even while hiding in fear for his life, reportedly could not help himself. According to the myth, he solved it by tying a thread to an ant and coaxing the small creature to crawl through the shell's winding passages, drawing the thread along behind it until it emerged, successfully threaded, at the opposite end. I find something wonderfully human in this detail, a small, quiet moment of comic relief nestled inside an otherwise tragic story. And it tells us something true about human nature that has not changed in 3,000 years. Even a man hiding from a furious king, even a man still carrying fresh grief for a son he had buried not long before, apparently could not resist the temptation of solving a genuinely elegant puzzle, even when solving it risked revealing exactly where he was hiding. And reveal him it did. Minos, recognizing immediately that only Daedalus could have devised such a solution, demanded that King Cocalus hand the fugitive craftsman over to face justice on Crete. But Cocalus, according to most versions of the myth, had grown genuinely fond of his talented guest and was reluctant to lose him. Instead of refusing outright, which might have provoked open conflict with a powerful foreign king, Cocalus agreed to hand Daedalus over, but asked for a short delay first, insisting that Minos be given proper hospitality, including, crucially, a warm bath before any formal proceedings began. What Minos did not know was that Cocalus' own daughters, according to the myth, had grown just as fond of Daedalus as their father had, and were unwilling to let him be taken away to face what would almost certainly have been a brutal execution back on Crete. While Minos bathed, the princesses, working together with Daedalus's own knowledge of hydraulics and heating systems, which is to say using the very ingenuity of the man they were trying to protect, arranged for scalding hot water, or in some versions boiling pitch, to be poured into the bath, killing King Minos before he ever had the chance to bring his fugitive craftsman back to face the wrath he had been nursing for years. It is a strange, almost darkly comic ending to the pursuit that had driven so much of this story's tension. The great and terrible King Minos, ruler of Crete, commander of the Labyrinth, father of the Minotaur, ultimately undone not through some grand battle or divine intervention, but through a scalding bath arranged by grateful young women determined to protect a grieving old inventor who had already lost nearly everything that mattered to him. Daedalus, according to the myths, lived out the remainder of his life in relative peace after this, though the ancient sources say little in detail about his final years. Some accounts suggest he continued working as a craftsman, continued building remarkable things for various patrons across the Mediterranean world, carrying his genius with him even as he carried, presumably, the permanent weight of grief for a son whose flight had ended so much sooner and so much more tragically than his own. I think it is worth sitting for a moment with the particular unfairness embedded in this outcome, because myths do not always distribute consequences in the way our modern sense of narrative justice might expect. Daedalus, whose original crime of jealous murder had started this entire chain of events all the way back in Athens, ultimately survived, escaped, rebuilt his life, and lived on for years afterward. Icarus, whose only real fault was the very human, very forgivable enthusiasm of youth caught up in an extraordinary new experience, paid for that enthusiasm with his entire future. There is no tidy moral arithmetic here, no clean lesson where wrongdoing is punished and innocence protected. There is only the messy, uneven way that consequences actually tend to fall in real life, landing sometimes on those who deserve them least, while those whose choices set events into motion in the first place continue onward, carrying their guilt quietly, invisibly, for however many years remain to them. Let's step back now, from the details of the myth itself, and spend some time considering why this particular story, out of the hundreds that survive from ancient Greece, has managed to remain so deeply embedded in how we think and speak, even thousands of years later. A story that kept being told. I want to spend some time now tracing how this particular myth traveled forward through the centuries, because I think the way a story gets reused and reinterpreted across time tells us almost as much about human nature as the original story itself. The earliest surviving references to Daedalus and his labyrinth appear in fragments and brief mentions, scattered across Greek literature going back centuries before Ovid ever sat down to write his fuller account. Homer mentions Daedalus briefly in the Iliad, describing a dancing floor he supposedly built for a princess named Ariadne, A small detail that tells us this craftsman's reputation for extraordinary skill had already become part of the shared cultural memory of the Greek world by the time the earliest epic poetry we still possess was being composed. But it was Ovid, writing in Rome around the very beginning of the modern calendar, who gave us the version of the Icarus story that has shaped nearly every retelling since. His account appears within a much larger work called the Metamorphoses, a sprawling collection of myths connected loosely by themes of transformation. And it is worth noting that Ovid places the story of Icarus's fall directly alongside other tales of humans who overreached the boundaries appropriate to mortals, suggesting that even in antiquity, storytellers understood this particular myth as part of a broader tradition of cautionary tales about ambition and its limits. The story did not remain frozen in its ancient form, however. Medieval European scholars and moralists, working within a strongly Christian intellectual framework, often reinterpreted classical myths like this one to align with religious teaching, and Icarus's fall became, in many medieval retellings and commentaries, a symbol of the sin of pride, the dangerous human tendency to reach beyond the limits God had set for mortal beings. This reading fit comfortably alongside broader medieval anxieties about human overreach, and it is genuinely interesting to consider how a myth originally rooted in a polytheistic Greek worldview, concerned with mortal limits relative to the gods, could be so smoothly absorbed into an entirely different religious framework centuries later, simply by shifting which authority the overreaching was understood to offend. By the time the Renaissance arrived, European artists and poets, newly enthusiastic about recovering and celebrating classical antiquity, returned to this story with fresh eyes, often finding in it not simply a moral warning, but a genuinely moving human tragedy worth depicting in its own right. Perhaps the most famous artistic treatment from this era comes from a painting long attributed to the Flemish artist Pieter Bruegel the Elder, depicting a rural landscape, a farmer plowing his field, a shepherd tending sheep, a ship sailing calmly past a peaceful coastline, with the fall of Icarus reduced to a small, almost easy-to-miss detail in the corner of the canvas. Just a pair of legs disappearing beneath the water's surface, while the rest of the world continues about its ordinary business, entirely unaware that anything remarkable has just happened nearby. I find this particular artistic choice extraordinarily powerful and worth pausing on for a moment, because it captures something the ancient sources themselves gesture toward, but never state quite so plainly. The painting suggests that even the most extraordinary human tragedy, the first flight in the history of the world ending in a fatal fall from the sky, might pass entirely unnoticed by the world around it, that ordinary life simply continues, indifferent, while something world-altering happens quietly at the margins. This idea, that suffering often occurs alongside a world too busy or too distant to notice, has resonated with poets and thinkers for centuries since, inspiring further works of art and poetry that use this same painting, and this same small, easily missed detail, as a starting point for reflecting on how human tragedy and human indifference so often exist side by side. Beyond visual art, The Icarus myth has embedded itself so thoroughly into everyday language that most people who use phrases related to it probably have no conscious memory of the original story at all. We speak of someone flying too close to the sun when we mean they have overreached, taken on too much risk, ignored warnings in pursuit of ambition that ultimately proved their undoing. This phrase appears constantly in modern commentary about business failures, political downfalls, athletic careers cut short by overconfidence, entire industries that expanded too quickly and collapsed under their own unsustainable weight. The myth has become, quite literally, a kind of shorthand vocabulary for describing a very specific pattern of human failure, one where early success breeds overconfidence, and overconfidence eventually invites a collapse that careful restraint might have avoided. The name Icarus itself has been attached, over the centuries, to an enormous range of human endeavors connected to flight and ambition. Early aviation pioneers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, attempting their own dangerous experiments with heavier-than-air flying machines, were frequently compared in newspapers to Icarus, sometimes admiringly, sometimes as a grim warning about the risks they were courting. When human beings finally did achieve true powered flight, and later when they achieved actual space flight, commentators reached instinctively for this same ancient myth, recognizing in it something that felt genuinely prophetic, a story imagined thousands of years before actual flight was possible, that nonetheless seemed to capture something true about the exhilaration and the danger bound up together whenever humans attempt to exceed what their bodies were naturally built to do. I think what strikes me most, considering this long afterlife the myth has enjoyed, is how flexible its central image has proven to be across so many different contexts and centuries. Depending on who is telling it and why, the story of Icarus can function as a warning against reckless ambition, a tender meditation on parental love and helplessness, a celebration of human ingenuity and the drive to exceed our natural limits, or simply a beautiful, melancholy image of a boy falling from the sky while the rest of the world continues, indifferent, about its ordinary business. Very few stories from the ancient world have proven capable of carrying so many different, sometimes even contradictory meanings across so many different centuries and cultural contexts. And I think that flexibility, more than any single interpretation, explains why this particular myth has survived so vividly, while countless other ancient stories have faded into obscurity, known now only to specialists and scholars. There is also, I think, something worth noting about how the story functions specifically as a story about craftsmanship and invention, a theme that resonates differently now than it might have resonated for its earliest audiences. We live in an era shaped profoundly by rapid technological change, by innovations that seemed impossible only decades or even years before they became commonplace, and by a persistent, often anxious cultural conversation about the risks bound up in pushing technology forward faster than our collective wisdom about how to use it safely can keep pace. Daedalus, the brilliant inventor whose greatest creation ultimately contributed to his own son's death, feels, in this light, like an uncannily early meditation on a tension that remains entirely relevant today. The gap that can open up between what human ingenuity makes possible and what human wisdom knows how to handle safely. Let's return now, before we close out this evening's story, to Crete itself, and to what eventually became of the civilization that first gave rise to this myth, because I think the actual historical fate of that world adds one more quiet layer of meaning to everything we have discussed tonight. What happened to the real Crete, the Minoan civilization that likely inspired the setting of this entire myth, did not last forever, and its actual historical decline is, in its own quiet way, just as fascinating as anything in the mythology it helped inspire. Sometime around the middle of the second millennium before the modern calendar, likely sometime in the 1500s or shortly after by most current estimates, though the exact dating remains genuinely debated among specialists, a massive volcanic eruption occurred on the island of Thera, known today as Santorini, roughly 70 miles north of Crete across open water. This was not an ordinary eruption. Geological evidence suggests it was one of the largest volcanic events of the last several thousand years, powerful enough to have collapsed the center of the island into the sea, creating the dramatic caldera that still defines Santorini's famous landscape today. The eruption would have sent massive tsunamis crashing across the northern coast of Crete, precisely the region where Knossos and the other great Minoan palaces stood, and would have blanketed significant portions of the eastern Mediterranean in volcanic ash, disrupting agriculture and likely damaging or destroying the Minoan fleet, which had been the very foundation of their trading power, and according to later Greek memory, their naval dominance over cities like Athens. Archaeologists continue to debate exactly how much this single eruption contributed to the eventual decline of Minoan civilization, since the palace at Knossos itself continued to be occupied and used for some further period afterward, suggesting the culture did not collapse in a single catastrophic moment, but rather weakened gradually over subsequent decades, becoming increasingly vulnerable to further disruptions, whether from continued environmental instability, internal political pressures, or eventually, outside conquest. That outside conquest, when it came, arrived in the form of Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland, the same broader cultural world that would later produce the heroes of the Trojan War stories, gradually asserting control over Crete in the centuries following the Thera eruption. Archaeological evidence suggests a genuine cultural shift taking place at Knossos during this period, including changes in administrative record-keeping, and even in artistic styles, that many scholars interpret as evidence of Mycenaean Greek rulers taking control of a civilization that had once been so thoroughly dominant across the Aegean. Eventually, sometime in the centuries that followed, even Mycenaean control over the region gave way to further waves of change and disruption that affected much of the broader eastern Mediterranean world, part of a larger, still not entirely understood collapse of Bronze Age civilizations across the region that historians sometimes refer to as the Late Bronze Age collapse. Great palace centers across Greece and the Near East were abandoned or destroyed within a relatively compressed span of time, trade networks that had connected the entire eastern Mediterranean for centuries broke down, and much of the region entered a period of reduced population, reduced literacy, and reduced monumental construction that later Greeks themselves, looking back on this era from a considerable historical distance, would eventually come to think of as something like a dark age separating their own world from a distant, half-remembered age of legendary kings and heroes. And this, I think, is genuinely important to understand, because it helps explain why the Greeks who eventually told and retold the myths we have been discussing tonight were not simply inventing pure fantasy out of nothing. They were living in the long aftermath of a real, genuinely impressive Bronze Age civilization whose physical remains, crumbling palace walls, half-buried courtyards, occasional fragments of once vivid frescoes peeking through centuries of accumulated soil, would have still been visible, still standing as mysterious ruins, across parts of Crete and the wider Aegean world for generations after the civilization itself had faded. Imagine a Greek farmer, centuries after the fall of Knossos, plowing a field and turning up fragments of painted plaster, pieces of pottery decorated with images of bulls and dolphins in a style utterly unlike anything produced by his own contemporaries. And imagine the kind of stories that farmers' community might have constructed to explain what they were looking at. A vanished civilization, a labyrinthine palace whose actual floor plan probably was genuinely confusing to anyone stumbling upon its ruins without a guide. A culture obsessed with bulls in ways that later generations could no longer fully explain or understand. Myths, in other words, often function as a kind of folk memory, imperfect and heavily transformed over generations of oral retelling, but not entirely disconnected from genuine historical experience. The labyrinth may well have begun as later generations' confused attempt to explain the genuinely bewildering floor plan of a real, abandoned Bronze Age palace. The bull imagery so central to the myth almost certainly reflects the genuine, well-documented importance of bulls in actual Minoan religious and artistic life. Even the tribute of youth sent from Athens to Crete may reflect some distant, transformed memory of actual political domination that Crete once exercised over parts of the Greek mainland during its centuries of naval power, centuries before that power collapsed, and the memory of it curdled over subsequent generations into a story about monsters and mazes and sacrificial victims. It was not until the early 20th century that the physical reality behind these ancient stories began to be properly rediscovered. The British archaeologist Arthur Evans, arriving on Crete in the final years of the 1800s, began excavating the site local tradition had long associated with the ancient palace of Knossos, and what he uncovered exceeded almost anything scholars of his era had expected to find. An enormous, genuinely labyrinthine complex of rooms and corridors, extraordinary frescoes still bearing traces of their original vivid color after more than 3,000 years buried beneath the earth, sophisticated evidence of plumbing and drainage systems that would not be matched again in Europe for centuries after the civilization that built them had vanished. Evans, working within the intellectual conventions and occasionally the questionable methods of his era, chose to name this entire rediscovered civilization after the legendary King Minos himself, calling them the Minoans, a name we still use today even though, of course, we have no way of knowing what these people actually called themselves, since their written language, the script scholars call linear A, remains, even now, only partially deciphered. Its secrets still holding out against more than a century of dedicated scholarly effort. I find something quietly moving in that last detail, honestly. We can walk through the actual physical corridors of the palace that likely inspired an entire mythology involving a labyrinth and a monster and a father and son who built wings to escape captivity. We can see the very frescoes of leaping bulls and dolphins that shaped Minoan artistic imagination. And yet the actual words these people used to describe their own lives, their own beliefs, their own version of whatever stories they might have told each other about their island and its history, remain locked away from us, written in a script we still cannot fully read. In a strange, almost poetic way, the Minoans themselves have become something like their own labyrinth, a civilization whose physical remains we can walk through freely, while the deepest, most personal parts of who they actually were remain just out of reach, hidden behind a linguistic wall that has resisted every attempt to fully break through it. Let's bring our story back now, from these broader historical currents, to the more intimate human scale where we began this evening, and spend our final chapter tonight simply sitting with what this story might mean, quietly, for anyone listening to it tonight from whatever corner of the world you happen to be resting in right now. The weight a parent carries, I want to spend some real time now, slowly, thinking through what this story actually teaches us about the relationship between Daedalus and his son, because I think it is easy, when retelling myths quickly, to reduce Icarus down to a single cautionary image, a boy who flew too high and paid for it, and to reduce Daedalus down to little more than a wise old man delivering advice that got ignored. But if you sit with the story a little longer, the way we have been doing tonight, something more complicated and more tender emerges. Think again about that moment in the tower, Daedalus fitting the wings onto his son's shoulders with trembling hands, tears on his face even as his fingers continued their careful, practiced work. This is not the image of a parent confidently handing over a perfectly safe tool. This is the image of a parent who understands, with complete clarity, exactly how dangerous what he is about to do actually is, and who is doing it anyway, because the alternative, remaining imprisoned in that tower indefinitely, was its own kind of danger, its own kind of slow death. There is something worth sitting with in that impossible calculation, because it is a calculation every parent eventually faces in one form or another, even if the stakes rarely involve literal wings and literal wax. At some point, every child a parent has raised and protected and warned and guided must eventually be allowed to step out into a world the parent cannot fully control, cannot fully protect them within, cannot follow closely enough to catch them if something goes wrong. Daedalus could build the wings. He could deliver the warning as clearly and as carefully as any warning has ever been delivered in the history of storytelling. But he could not fly alongside his son closely enough, could not hold onto him tightly enough, to guarantee the boy would actually survive the journey. At some point, he simply had to let go, had to trust that the careful preparation he had provided would be enough, knowing all the while that it might not be. This, I think, is why the story has resonated so powerfully with parents specifically, across so many different centuries and cultures. Every parent eventually reaches a moment, sometimes many such moments across the years of raising a child, when careful preparation must give way to trust, when warnings have been delivered as thoroughly as they can be delivered, and all that remains is to watch, from whatever distance circumstances allow, as your child makes their own choices in a world you can no longer fully shape or control. Sometimes those choices go well. Sometimes, as in this story, they do not. And the parent, no matter how much wisdom or skill or love went into the preparation beforehand, is often left simply watching, unable to intervene in the moment when intervention would actually matter most. I want to also spend a little time thinking about Icarus himself, and about the particular unfairness, gentle unfairness perhaps, but unfairness nonetheless, in how his character has often been remembered across the centuries. He is frequently reduced, in casual retellings and in the shorthand version of his name that has entered our everyday language, to a symbol of reckless overconfidence, a cautionary example of what happens when youthful arrogance ignores wise counsel. But I think if we sit honestly with the actual details of the myth, a more sympathetic picture emerges. Consider what Icarus had actually experienced in the days and weeks leading up to that flight. Weeks of confinement in a tower, watching birds through a narrow window with nothing but longing, no real understanding of when or whether he might ever be released, no clear sense of what future, if any, awaited him under a king furious enough with his father to imprison them both indefinitely. And then, suddenly, an escape more extraordinary than anything he could have previously imagined, wings that actually worked, an experience of freedom and flight that no human being before him had ever had the chance to feel. Is it truly so difficult to understand why a boy in that specific situation, having just discovered something so overwhelming and so joyful after weeks of fear and confinement, might have found it hard to maintain perfect, disciplined caution in the exact moment when caution mattered most? I do not say this to excuse away the tragedy, or to suggest the warning did not matter. It clearly did matter, and the consequences of ignoring it were real and devastating. But I think there is room in how we tell this story to hold both truths together at once: the reality that the warning was important and should have been followed more carefully, and the deep, aching sympathy we ought to feel for a young person who, in a moment of genuine, overwhelming joy after real suffering, simply forgot, for a few crucial minutes, just how fragile that joy actually was. There is also something worth considering about the particular nature of the danger in this story, because I think it carries a subtler meaning than simple recklessness. The wings did not fail because Icarus did something reckless in the sense of taking some dramatic, obviously foolish action. He did not deliberately dive toward the sun in some act of youthful defiance. He simply climbed gradually, drawn upward by the sheer, understandable pleasure of what he was experiencing, each additional bit of altitude feeling in the moment like a small, harmless extension of a joy that had already proven, mile after safe mile, to be real and sustainable. The danger crept up on him precisely because it did not announce itself dramatically. It arrived gradually, through a series of choices that each felt, individually, entirely reasonable, until the cumulative effect of all of them together had carried him somewhere his father's warning had specifically told him not to go. I think this is actually one of the most quietly wise observations buried inside this ancient story, and one that remains entirely relevant to how we understand risk and failure today. Catastrophic mistakes rarely announce themselves as catastrophic mistakes in the moment they are being made. They usually arrive disguised as a series of small, individually reasonable-seeming choices, each one only slightly beyond the boundary of what came before it, until the cumulative distance traveled from safety becomes far greater than anyone, including the person making the choices, ever consciously intended. Let's think, too, for a moment, about Daedalus's own choices earlier in the story, because I think there is an interesting symmetry worth noticing here, one that most retellings do not spend much time on. Remember that Daedalus's exile from Athens, the event that eventually brought him to Crete in the first place, came about because of his own jealousy toward a talented young apprentice, jealousy severe enough to end in violence. There is something quietly poignant in recognizing that the same man who eventually gave everything, wept openly, poured every ounce of his skill into protecting his own son, had once, years earlier, been unable to control a similarly destructive impulse toward another young person entrusted to his guidance. Whether the ancient audiences who told and retold this story consciously intended this parallel, or whether it emerged more organically across generations of retelling, I cannot say for certain. But I think it adds a genuinely interesting layer of complexity to Daedalus's character, a reminder that even history's greatest craftsmen and inventors remain, underneath all their cleverness, flawed and complicated human beings, capable of both devastating failure and devastating love, sometimes within the very same lifetime. Let's slow down even further now, and spend some time simply imagining what an ordinary evening on ancient Crete might have looked like for families who had nothing at all to do with kings or labyrinths or monsters. Because I think there is something restful in returning, before we close tonight, to the quiet texture of ordinary lives lived alongside these extraordinary events. An ordinary evening on ancient Crete, I want to close out the historical portion of tonight's story by stepping away from kings and monsters and doomed flights entirely, and simply spending some quiet time imagining what an evening might have looked like for an ordinary family living somewhere in the countryside surrounding Knossos. People who had no direct involvement in any of the events we have spent tonight discussing, but whose daily rhythms would have continued steadily underneath all of it. The way ordinary life always does continue underneath the extraordinary events that later become the stories worth remembering. Picture a small farming household, perhaps a few miles inland from the palace itself, close enough that news and rumor from Knossos would eventually reach them, but far enough that the daily concerns of kings and craftsmen rarely touched their own lives directly. As evening approached, the light over the Cretan hills would have taken on that particular golden quality common to Mediterranean landscapes, long shadows stretching from olive trees whose gnarled, silvery trunks had likely stood in that same spot for generations already, since olive trees, remarkably, can live for many centuries. meaning the very trees shading this family's home might well have already been old when Daedalus first arrived on the island as an exile from Athens. Imagine a mother calling her children in from the fields as the light began to fade, her voice carrying across terraced hillsides planted with grapevines and grain, the particular rhythm of Cretan agricultural life, shaped by a climate that demanded hard, concentrated labor during certain seasons, and allowed for slower, quieter rhythms during others. The evening meal for a family like this would have been simple but not meager. Bread, again, the true staple of almost every meal in this world, baked earlier in the day in a small clay oven built into the exterior wall of the home, its heat still lingering pleasantly in the surrounding air even after the fire itself had burned down to embers. Alongside the bread, perhaps a stew of lentils or beans, flavored with wild herbs gathered from the surrounding hillsides, thyme and oregano and wild fennel growing freely across the Cretan countryside, in a way that still characterizes the island's landscape and cuisine even today, thousands of years later. Cheese, made from the milk of goats kept by nearly every rural household, aged just enough to develop a sharp, tangy flavor that would have paired well with the coarse bread. And oil, always oil, pressed from the olives that grew everywhere across the island, used not just for cooking but for lamps, for skin care, for 100 small daily purposes that made olive cultivation absolutely central to Cretan life, in a way that is genuinely difficult for those of us living in a modern world of diverse, easily available cooking fats and industrial lighting to fully appreciate. As darkness settled fully over the countryside, imagine this family gathering close around whatever light source they had available, most likely a simple oil lamp, its small flame casting flickering shadows across a single main room that likely served as kitchen, dining space, and gathering place all at once. The particular smell of burning olive oil, slightly smoky, mixing with the lingering sense of the evening meal and the drier, earthier smell of the packed dirt or stone floor beneath their feet. Outside, the sounds of the countryside settling into night, crickets beginning their steady chorus, perhaps the distant bleating of goats being herded into whatever simple enclosure protected them from nighttime predators, the occasional call of a night bird somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of the lamp's small circle of light. This would have been a time, in households like this one, for stories. Long before any of these tales were written down by poets like Ovid centuries later, they existed and traveled entirely through oral tradition, told and retold around exactly these kinds of small evening fires, shaped and reshaped slightly with each new telling, details added or dropped depending on which particular storyteller was speaking and which particular audience was listening. Imagine an older relative, a grandmother perhaps, settling the youngest children close beside her as the evening deepened, beginning to tell some version of a story about the great palace not far away, about a labyrinth built to hide a terrible secret, about a clever craftsman who had once built wings and flown, impossibly, across the open sea. Would this family, gathered around their own small lamp, have known the story in anything close to the form we have been telling it tonight? Almost certainly not exactly. Oral traditions shift and change constantly, and the version told in one village might have differed meaningfully from the version told in another, each community emphasizing different details, drawing different morals, remembering different names for characters that other tellings might handle differently entirely. This is worth remembering whenever we discuss ancient mythology as though it existed in some single, fixed, authoritative form. What we possess today, largely thanks to writers like Ovid, who eventually committed particular versions to durable written form, represents only a narrow slice of what was likely a much broader, more varied, more constantly evolving oral tradition, told and retold in countless slightly different forms across generations of ordinary families just like the one we have been imagining tonight, gathered around their own small fires, on their own quiet evenings, thousands of years before any of us were born. I find something genuinely comforting in this image, honestly, and I think it connects meaningfully to what we are doing together right now, tonight, in this very different context. Human beings have been gathering at the end of long days, in whatever quiet light they had available, and telling each other stories to help process the world, to pass along wisdom, to simply enjoy the shared pleasure of a well-told tale before finally settling into sleep. For as long as anything resembling human civilization has existed, the specific technology has changed enormously across those thousands of years, oil lamps giving way eventually to candles, to gas lighting, to electric bulbs, to whatever screen is currently providing the gentle light you might be resting beside as you listen to these words tonight. But the underlying human need, the desire to hear a good story slowly and carefully told before finally letting go of the day and drifting toward sleep, has remained remarkably constant across all of that technological change. So in some small way, by listening to this story tonight, whatever device is carrying my voice to you, you are participating in something genuinely ancient, a tradition of evening storytelling that connects you, distantly but genuinely, to that imagined family gathered around their small oil lamp somewhere in the Cretan countryside, thousands of years ago, listening to their own version of this same tale, and to countless other families across countless other centuries and cultures who have done essentially the same thing in their own languages, by their own particular kinds of firelight, all the way up to this very moment tonight, wherever you happen to be resting right now. Let's bring this evening's story to its close now, gently, the way any good bedtime story should end. Other wings, other skies before we settle into our closing thoughts tonight. I want to take a brief detour, a gentle wandering path rather than a sharp turn, into a handful of other stories from other cultures that echo, in their own distinct ways, this same deep human fascination with flight, with fathers and sons, and with the particular danger of reaching beyond what our bodies were built to do. I find that placing a myth alongside its distant cousins from other traditions often deepens our appreciation for what makes each individual story distinct, and I think tonight is a good time to wander a little before we come back to rest. In Norse mythology, there exists a figure named Valand, sometimes rendered in English as Wayland the Smith, a legendary craftsman whose story shares surprising similarities with that of Daedalus despite emerging from an entirely separate cultural tradition, likely developing independently rather than through any direct historical connection between the two mythologies. Valand, like Daedalus, was a smith of extraordinary skill, imprisoned by a cruel king who wished to keep his talents entirely for himself, hamstrung to prevent his escape by ordinary means, and forced to work in captivity crafting treasures for his captor. And like Daedalus, Valand eventually engineered his own escape through flight, fashioning wings, according to the surviving versions of this old Germanic tale, that allowed him to rise up and away from his prison, leaving his captor behind in a moment of triumphant, hard-won freedom. The differences between these two stories matter just as much as their similarities, though. Where Daedalus's story centers heavily on the tragic loss of his son, Valand's story leans more heavily into themes of vengeance, since before his escape, according to the more complete versions of this old tale, Valand exacted a brutal revenge against the king who had imprisoned him. This is worth noting because it reminds us that even similar core images, a caged craftsman, wings built to escape, can be woven by different cultures into stories carrying very different emotional centers and moral concerns, shaped by the particular values and preoccupations of the society doing the telling. Elsewhere in world mythology, flight itself, independent of any specific craftsman figure, appears again and again as a symbol loaded with both promise and danger. In certain strands of Chinese mythology, we find stories of immortals and sages capable of flight through cultivated spiritual mastery, a very different framing from the mechanical, craftsman-driven flight of the Icarus story, suggesting a cultural tradition that imagined flight less as a technological achievement to be engineered, and more as a spiritual state to be earned through discipline and cultivation over a lifetime. In various traditions across the Americas, including certain Mesoamerican mythologies, we encounter feathered serpent deities and other winged figures whose ability to move between earth and sky often symbolizes a connection between the mortal world and divine or ancestral realms. Flight here functioning less as human achievement or human overreach, and more as a marker of genuine divinity, a capacity reserved specifically for beings who existed above and beyond ordinary human limitation. What I find genuinely striking, laying these various traditions gently alongside one another, is how consistently human cultures across the world, entirely independent of any contact or influence between them, arrived at flight as a symbol worth building entire mythologies around. There is something in the simple, universal human experience of watching a bird rise effortlessly into open air, an experience available to virtually every human culture that has ever existed, regardless of geography or historical period, that seems to have consistently sparked the same deep, aching wonder, the same quiet longing to somehow share in that particular freedom, and the same recognition, arrived at again and again across cultures that never spoke to one another, that reaching for that freedom often carries genuine danger alongside its genuine beauty. I think this helps explain, in part, why the Icarus story specifically has traveled so far beyond its original Greek context, resonating with audiences across cultures and centuries who share little else in common with the world that first produced it. It taps into something that appears to run remarkably deep in human imagination generally, not just within the specific cultural tradition of ancient Greece. There is one more small, quiet detail I want to share before we move toward our closing thoughts tonight, because I think it captures something lovely about how far this ancient story has ultimately traveled. When astronomers and scientists in the 20th century began mapping and naming features on the surface of the moon, using names drawn largely from the history of astronomy and from classical mythology, one of the craters they named was called Icarus, honoring the same boy whose fall we have spent this entire evening slowly retelling. There is something quietly moving in that choice. A boy from an ancient story about the danger and the wonder of flight, whose name now marks a permanent feature on the surface of the moon, a place human beings have actually, genuinely flown to, using technology and courage and careful engineering that would have seemed like pure divine magic to anyone living in the world that first told his story nearly 3,000 years earlier. In a strange, quiet way, I think Icarus finally did make it, eventually, even if it took nearly 3,000 years and an entirely different set of wings, built by an entirely different kind of craftsman to get there. Let's bring this evening's journey to its close now, slowly and gently, the way we always do. What stays with us, I think what I keep returning to, turning this story over slowly in my mind the way you might turn a smooth stone over in your palm, is how much of it is actually about ordinary things dressed up in extraordinary circumstances. A father worried about his son. A boy caught up in the joy of something new and wonderful, forgetting, for a little while, the careful limits he had been warned to respect. A parent left afterward to carry a grief that never fully leaves, even as life continues forward around him, demanding that he keep moving, keep working, keep existing in a world that no longer contains the person he loved most. None of that requires ancient Crete or magical wings to feel true. Strip away the mythic details, the labyrinth, the bull-headed monster, the melting wax, and you are left with something almost painfully familiar. A parent doing everything within their power to prepare a child for a danger the child cannot yet fully understand. A young person, brimming with enthusiasm and capability, occasionally outpacing the caution that experience alone can teach. And the quiet, aching truth that sometimes, despite every careful preparation, despite every warning delivered with real love and real urgency, things still go wrong in ways no one could have fully prevented. I do not think this story asks us to conclude that ambition itself is dangerous, or that reaching for extraordinary things should be avoided out of fear of failure. If anything, I think the deepest tenderness in this myth lies precisely in how much genuine wonder it preserves alongside its tragedy. Icarus's flight, however briefly it lasted, however it ultimately ended, was real. He experienced something no human being before him had ever experienced. He felt, if only for a handful of miles across open water, what it actually meant to move through open sky the way the birds he had envied through that narrow tower window had always moved. That experience was not erased or diminished by what came afterward. It happened. It was his, fully and completely, for exactly as long as it lasted. I think there is something worth carrying forward from that, something gentler than the simple warning most people remember from this story's shorthand version. Yes, be mindful of your limits. Yes, listen carefully to the hard-won wisdom of those who love you and have walked further down whatever path you are just beginning to travel. But do not let that caution curdle into a fear so complete that it keeps you from ever stepping off the ledge at all. Daedalus himself, after all, was the one who built the wings in the first place. He did not choose safety over possibility. He chose careful, thoughtful risk, built on genuine observation and hard-earned skill, over the certain, slow defeat of remaining imprisoned forever. The tragedy of this story is not that Icarus flew. The tragedy is simply that, in the joy of flying, he forgot, for a few crucial minutes, the specific boundary his father had asked him to respect. There is a version of wisdom, I think, that this story quietly offers us, one that sits somewhere between reckless abandon and paralyzed caution. Fly, it seems to say. Build your wings. Take the leap your circumstances require of you, even when no one has ever successfully done what you are attempting before. But remember as you rise that the middle course, neither too high nor too low, neither too reckless nor too fearful, is usually the one that actually gets you safely to wherever you are trying to go. It is simple advice, almost deceptively simple, the kind of thing that sounds almost too obvious to bear repeating. And yet, nearly 3,000 years later, we are all still finding ways to forget it, still finding ourselves, in one form or another, climbing a little higher than we probably should, caught up in the genuine, understandable joy of something going better than we expected. I think, too, about Daedalus's grief, and about how the story handles it with a kind of restraint that I find genuinely moving the more I sit with it. The ancient sources do not dwell excessively on his suffering. They tell us he wept, that he searched, that he buried his son, that he named an island after him. And then, quietly, without extensive commentary, they tell us he continued on, flew onward to Sicily, kept building remarkable things, kept living whatever remained of his own long life. There is no suggestion that his grief simply disappeared, no false comfort offered about time healing every wound completely. There is only the quiet, honest acknowledgement that life, even after the most devastating loss imaginable, tends to continue asking things of us, tends to require that we keep moving forward, keep working, keep engaging with whatever remains of our own existence, even while carrying a weight that never fully lifts. I think that particular honesty, the refusal to offer easy comfort or a tidy emotional resolution, is part of what has allowed this story to remain genuinely meaningful across so many centuries, rather than fading into the kind of simple moral fable that loses its power once its lesson has been extracted and repeated a few times. This story does not resolve neatly. Icarus does not come back to life. Daedalus does not find some redemptive meaning that makes the loss worthwhile. He simply carries it, the way real people carry real losses, forward into whatever years remain to him, and the story trusts us, its listeners, to sit with that unresolved weight honestly, rather than rushing to smooth it over with false comfort. I want to close tonight by returning, one final time, to that image of the tower window, Daedalus watching birds rise and glide on currents of air he could not yet fully understand, slowly, patiently, beginning to see not just beauty but mechanism, not just wonder but possibility. I think there is something worth carrying into your own rest tonight in that particular kind of patient attention, the willingness to look closely and carefully at something everyone else simply glances past, to wonder, quietly and persistently, whether an answer to an impossible-seeming problem might be hiding in plain sight, waiting only for someone patient enough to notice it. Whatever impossible-seeming walls exist around your own life right now, whatever tower you might feel confined within, I hope there is some small comfort in remembering that human beings have been finding unexpected ways out of impossible-seeming situations for as long as we have existed, using nothing more than patient observation, careful craftsmanship, and a willingness to try something that had never quite been tried in exactly that way before. Not every escape ends perfectly. This one certainly did not. But the attempt itself, the patient, careful work of building something new out of feathers and wax and quiet determination, remains, I think, one of the most genuinely hopeful images our species has ever produced, even wrapped as it is around such a tender, aching loss. Let's rest now together, in that quiet space between wonder and sorrow that this old story has carried for so many centuries, and let's close out this evening gently. A few last images before sleep before we close entirely. I want to walk back through this story one final time, slowly, gently, the way you might flip back through a few favorite pages of a book before finally setting it down for the night. There is no new information here, nothing you need to hold on to or remember. Just images, offered quietly, one after another, for you to rest inside as your own thoughts begin to slow and settle. Picture the island of Crete at dawn, the sky lightening gradually from deep blue to soft gold along the eastern horizon. The palace of Knossos still and quiet in those first hours before the household fully wakes, painted dolphins on plastered walls catching the earliest light, corridors empty and cool, waiting for the first footsteps of servants moving toward the kitchens. Picture Daedalus, years earlier, arriving on this island as a stranger, carrying with him both extraordinary skill and a quiet, private grief for a mistake he could never fully undo, finding in this new place a kind of purpose, a workshop full of good wood and bronze tools, a king eager for his talents, a life slowly rebuilding itself out of exile. Picture the labyrinth taking shape beneath careful hands, stone by stone, corridor folding into corridor, a structure built to confuse and contain, rising slowly across months of steady, patient labor, until finally it stood complete, ready to hold the secret it had been built to hide. Picture the tower by the sea afterward, when the same skilled hands that had built that labyrinth found themselves imprisoned within its very design. A father and a son together in a small stone room, watching gulls wheel and dive against a pale sky, beginning slowly to imagine an answer that no one had ever imagined before. Picture the feathers, gathered one by one from a narrow windowsill, sorted by size, arranged in careful rows across a stone floor, small and large, joined together with linen thread and warmed, softened wax, until two sets of wings lay finished, catching the light like something almost alive. Picture the fitting of those wings, a father's trembling hands adjusting straps across his son's shoulders, a warning delivered quietly and with real love. Fly the middle course, not too high, not too low, and an embrace held a moment longer than necessary, because some part of that father already understood how much uncertainty waited just beyond that tower window. Picture the leap itself, the sudden absence of solid ground, the terrifying drop before the wings caught the moving air, and then, astonishingly, lift, two figures rising together over open water, the island of Crete shrinking slowly beneath them, fishermen below looking upward in open-mouthed wonder at something the world had never seen before. Picture the growing confidence of that flight, mile after safe mile passing beneath them, small islands appearing and falling away in the deep blue distance, a boy discovering, more completely than any human being before him, the sheer unbroken joy of moving freely through open sky. Picture the boy climbing higher, drawn upward by pure delight, the warmth of the sun growing stronger against his skin, small feathers beginning, one by one, to work themselves loose and drift away, unnoticed at first, then impossible to ignore. Picture his father glancing upward, calling out across a widening distance, watching helplessly as wings that had carried his son so joyfully only minutes before began, gently and then all at once, to fail. And picture, finally, the quiet that followed. A stretch of open water, feathers scattered gently across its surface, a father circling low, searching, and eventually, a small island where a boy was laid to rest, and a sea that has carried his name for nearly 3,000 years since, patient and constant, indifferent to time in the particular way that only the sea and the sky have ever truly been. Let these images settle now, quietly, the way sediment settles slowly through still water. No need to hold onto any single one of them too tightly. Just let them drift, the way feathers once drifted down onto a calm Aegean Sea, and let your own thoughts begin to drift alongside them, slower now, softer now, ready to rest. The Craftsman's wider legacy before we close for the night entirely. I want to spend a few final quiet minutes on Daedalus himself, because his story, threaded throughout Greek mythology in small, scattered mentions, extends well beyond the wings and the labyrinth we have spent tonight exploring. And I think a few of these additional details are worth resting inside before we finally let this evening's story go. One figure connected to the wider mythology surrounding Crete, and sometimes connected loosely to Daedalus's own story, is a bronze giant named Talos, said to patrol the coastline of the island, circling it 3 times each day, watching for approaching ships and hurling boulders at any vessel that seemed to threaten Cretan shores. According to some versions of the myth, Talos had a single vein of a mysterious substance running from his neck down to his ankle, sealed with a bronze pin, and it was this single vulnerable point that eventually allowed the sorceress Medea, traveling with Jason and the Argonauts on their own famous voyage, to bring the giant down, tricking him into removing the pin and letting whatever divine substance animated his bronze body drain slowly away until he finally collapsed, lifeless, onto the rocky shore he had guarded for so long. Some ancient sources credit Daedalus himself with having built Talos, adding yet another extraordinary invention to a reputation already crowded with them, though other versions attribute the bronze guardian to different craftsmen entirely, or describe him as a gift from the gods rather than a human creation at all. This inconsistency is worth noting, honestly, because it reflects something true about how ancient mythology actually functioned. These stories were never written down once, in a single authoritative version, and then simply preserved unchanged forever afterward. They existed as living oral traditions for centuries before most of them, were ever committed to durable written form, and different storytellers, working in different regions and different generations, quite naturally attributed similar feats to whichever legendary figures best fit the particular version of the story they happened to be telling. Daedalus, as the single most famous craftsman in the entire Greek mythological tradition, became something of a magnet for these kinds of attributions, absorbing credit for various extraordinary inventions across multiple, sometimes contradictory, strands of storytelling. We touched earlier on the story of Daedalus's exile from Athens, following the death of his young apprentice, and it is worth noting that this apprentice appears under different names depending on which ancient source you consult, sometimes called Talos, an interesting overlap with the bronze giant's name that may or may not be entirely coincidental, and sometimes called Perdix. In the version involving Perdix, the story carries an additional, quietly strange detail. According to this account, as the boy fell from the height where Daedalus had pushed him, the goddess Athena, moved by pity, transformed him mid-fall into a partridge, a bird that to this day, according to ancient Greek natural observation, flies low to the ground and nests close to the earth rather than in high trees, forever cautious. The myth suggests of heights ever since that long ago fall. I find this small detail worth pausing on, honestly, because it creates an eerie, quiet echo with the ending of the Icarus story we have spent this entire evening exploring. Two falls, connected across time by the same family line, one ending in transformation and survival, however permanently altered, and one ending in death. Whether ancient audiences hearing both stories in sequence would have consciously noticed this parallel, I cannot say for certain, but I think it adds an interesting, melancholy resonance to Daedalus's entire arc across Greek mythology, a man whose story is bookended by two falls involving young people under his care, one that he caused directly through his own jealous violence, and one that resulted, more tragically and more accidentally, from a rescue attempt built with nothing but love and genuine desperation. There are other, gentler stories attached to Daedalus's reputation as well, details that speak less to tragedy and more simply to the sheer, almost mythic scale of his skill as a craftsman. Ancient writers described wooden statues, attributed to his workshop, so remarkably lifelike that observers reportedly believed they might step down from their pedestals and walk away entirely on their own, their eyes seeming to track movement across a room, their limbs positioned with such careful, anatomically precise detail that later Greek writers used Daedalus's name almost as a kind of shorthand for describing any work of art that achieved an unusually convincing, almost unsettling degree of realism. Whether any of these specific statues ever actually existed in the form the myths describe, or whether this reputation grew, as such reputations often do, through generations of storytellers, each adding a little more wonder to an already impressive legend, we cannot know for certain. But the reputation itself tells us something valuable about how deeply Greek culture admired technical skill and craftsmanship, treating genuine mastery of a trade as something worthy of mythic celebration, deserving of stories that would carry a craftsman's name forward across centuries, long after the actual physical objects he built had crumbled away entirely. I think there is something worth sitting with in the fact that Daedalus, more than almost any other figure in Greek mythology, is remembered primarily for what his hands could make, rather than for any divine parentage, any heroic battle, any grand military conquest. He is not a demigod, born from some union between a mortal and a god, the way Hercules or Perseus were. He is simply, at his core, an exceptionally skilled human craftsman, whose genius lay entirely in careful observation, patient experimentation, and the steady, practiced skill built up across a lifetime spent working with his own two hands. In a mythological tradition otherwise crowded with gods and monsters and heroes of semi-divine birth, there is something quietly refreshing about a legendary figure whose extraordinary reputation rests entirely on ordinary human capability, stretched, through patience and genius, toward its absolute furthest limits. Let's take that thought gently into our final closing moments together tonight, because I think it offers a fitting note to end on. A reminder that some of the oldest, most enduring stories in human memory are not really about gods or monsters at all, but about what ordinary human hands, given enough patience and enough love, are capable of building. The harbor AT night before we close, I want to offer one more small, quiet scene, separate from the main thread of the story, simply because I think it belongs to the same world we have been resting inside all evening, and because there is something genuinely peaceful in picturing it before sleep finally arrives. Imagine the harbor below Knossos on an ordinary night, long after most of the surrounding town had gone still. Fishing boats resting low in the water, their hulls knocking softly and rhythmically against wooden piers with each small movement of the tide, a sound almost like slow, patient breathing if you let yourself listen to it for long enough. Ropes creaking faintly where they held each vessel in place. The particular smell of a working harbor after dark, salt water and old rope, and the lingering trace of the day's catch, mixed with wood smoke drifting down from cooking fires still smoldering low in nearby homes. A night watchman, perhaps, walking slowly along the harbor's edge, carrying a small lamp whose flame bent and steadied with each breath of sea air, checking that the boats remained secure, that nothing had come loose in the evening's gentle wind. Overhead, more stars than most of us living under modern artificial light will ever have the chance to see clearly, an entire unbroken sweep of them stretching from one dark horizon to the other. The same stars, more or less, that would have looked down on Daedalus during his own restless nights of watching birds through a narrow tower window. The same stars that watched Icarus take his first uncertain steps toward that tower's edge. And the same stars, in some quiet, continuous sense, that are likely shining somewhere above you right now too, whether or not clouds or city light happen to be hiding them from view tonight. There is something in that continuity I find worth resting inside as we close. The sea that took Icarus is the same sea, chemically and physically, if not in any single unbroken body of water, that still moves and breathes along coastlines around the world today. The stars that Daedalus might have watched, waiting through long, anxious nights in that tower, are largely the same stars, give or take the slow, almost imperceptible drift of centuries, that continue turning overhead tonight. 3,000 years is an enormous span of time by any human measure, long enough for entire civilizations to rise, flourish, and vanish entirely, long enough for languages to transform beyond recognition, and for scripts to become so thoroughly forgotten that scholars still cannot fully read them today. And yet the sea keeps moving. The stars keep turning. The particular, ordinary comfort of a quiet harbor at night, boats resting gently against their moorings, a lamp moving slowly along a dark shoreline, remains recognizable across the entire span of that unimaginable stretch of time. I think that continuity, more than almost anything else in tonight's story, is worth carrying with you into sleep. Whatever worries followed you into this story tonight, whatever tower you might feel confined within in your own life right now, the same patient, ancient rhythms that carried Daedalus and Icarus through their own long-ago night are still moving quietly around you too. The same tides, the same turning stars, the same slow, steady passage of ordinary time that has always, eventually, carried human beings through even their most difficult and uncertain nights. Rest now in that quiet continuity. Let the harbor grow still. Let the lamp finally be set down. Let the whole ancient world we have spent this evening imagining together settle gently back into the deep, patient stillness of history, ready to wait there, undisturbed, until the next quiet evening when you might want to visit it again. And so we come, gently, to the end of tonight's story. A father and a son, a tower by the sea, wings built from stolen feathers and warm candle wax, a flight that carried a boy higher and further than any human being had ever traveled before him, and a fall that gave an entire stretch of the Aegean Sea its name for nearly 3,000 years afterward. A labyrinth built to hide one terrible secret that ended up becoming, for its own architect, a prison holding an entirely different kind of secret, a father's desperate, loving plan to give his son back the sky. I hope, if you are still with me at this point, that your body has settled deeply into wherever you are resting right now, that your breathing has slowed without you needing to think about it, and that whatever thoughts brought you into tonight's story have loosened their grip a little, replaced instead by feathers and wax and warm Mediterranean light, by ancient palace corridors and small fishing boats and ordinary families gathered around their own small fires thousands of years before any of us were born. Before I let you go fully into sleep, I want to ask you one more time to tell me where you are listening from tonight and what time it happens to be there right now. I love reading these comments more than almost anything else about making this channel. This strange, quiet privilege of knowing that somewhere in Ohio it might be well past midnight, while somewhere in Melbourne the afternoon sun is still bright outside a window. All of you gathered together, in your own separate moments, around this same ancient story about a boy and his father and a pair of wings that almost worked. Tell me your city. Tell me your time. And if you have a moment before sleep finally takes you, tell me what part of tonight's story stayed with you the longest. Was it the wings themselves, built so carefully from feathers and wax? Was it the warning, delivered with trembling hands in that small stone tower? Was it the quiet island afterward, and the sea that has carried a boy's name for 3,000 years? I read every comment, even the ones that arrived days or weeks after I first post this, and I promise it means something real to me. Hearing from all of you scattered so widely across so many different clocks and calendars, all choosing, in your own separate moments, to spend some of your last waking minutes here with this old story. If tonight's journey through ancient Crete helped ease you toward sleep, I would be so grateful if you considered subscribing to this channel, Boring History for Sleep. It costs nothing at all, takes only a moment, and it means a new story will be waiting for you the next time your own mind will not quite let go of the day behind you. We have walked together across many nights now, through the story of Theseus and the creature waiting in the dark heart of this very same labyrinth, through Perseus and the long, difficult road toward a monster he was almost too frightened to face, through Hades and the quiet, often misunderstood kingdom he ruled beneath the earth, and through Medusa, whose own story deserves far more sympathy than she has usually been given across so many centuries of retelling. If any of those sound like companions for another sleepless night sometime soon, they are waiting for you, whenever you need them. And if there is a particular story, a particular figure from ancient history or ancient mythology, that you find yourself wishing someone would finally slow down and tell properly, the way we have tried to slow down and tell Icarus and Daedalus' story tonight, leave that request in the comments as well. I read through those requests carefully when planning which stories to tell next, and there is a genuine chance that whatever you are curious about tonight becomes the very story I am telling you, some quiet evening a few weeks or months from now. For tonight, though, let this be enough. Let the wings settle. Let the sea grow still and quiet beneath a darkening sky. Let the small stone tower fade back into the pale afternoon light of a Cretan hillside that has stood mostly unchanged for thousands of years, indifferent to kings and monsters and grieving fathers alike. Patient the way only very old places can be patient, waiting quietly for whoever might come along next to notice them, and to wonder, and to imagine, the way we have spent this whole evening wondering and imagining together. Thank you for spending this quiet stretch of your evening with me, wherever in the world that evening happens to be unfolding right now. Sleep well, rest deeply, and I will see you again soon for another long, slow walk through history. Good night.